When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube. Welcome back to the Grease Goblins YouTube channel. Today's video, I want to talk about a Game of Thrones and every single chapter in the book. We're going to be doing a ranking, very quick breakdown for each episode just to kind of show you guys why I think maybe this chapter is lower or higher than others. And yeah, we're going to talk about all the chapters. I want to point this out that I've only done this once before. I did this with Feast for Crows for my retrospective series, and I can already tell you from the get-go, a Feast for Crows is much easier than a Game of Thrones for a lot of reasons. One, the size of chapters, for instance, Feast for Crows does not have as many chapters as Game of Thrones. Not even close. Two, I think Feast for Crows is quite cut and dry on where chapters should be in terms of like the top end, the lower end, and then like the middle. I think the middle is the most open to interpretation. But for Game of Thrones, I don't think that's the case. There could be a chapter that I have ranked at like number 20, and you could think it's like a top 5. That's just how a Game of Thrones is. The consistency from chapter to chapter is just fantastic. And so one of the reasons why I look at this book and say it's probably the best written book is because there isn't a lot of drop in quality or rise in quality from one chapter to another. This book stays fairly consistent. And so I do want to point it out. If you see a chapter that you really love and it's in the lower like 20, it's probably not because it's a bad chapter. It's because probably I just prefer other chapters to read. I like more of the character work maybe going on in this chapter, the plot that's going on. So yeah, a lot of things kind of factor into this. I think if you're a short chapter, it's going to be, of course, harder for you to beat a longer chapter, for instance, because you're just getting more content in that longer chapter. And being a longer chapter doesn't mean you automatically get higher on this ranking. But if it's a longer chapter, usually we're getting more character work, we're getting more of the plot. But that's not always the case, like I saw in Feast for Crows with some of the early Brienne chapters where they were really long and they weren't, too good. They were a bit slow. They didn't really focus Brienne at all. That's kind of not really going to be the case here with Game of Thrones, because I feel like all the chapters are around the same page length, but I would definitely look at the first couple of chapters of a Game of Thrones are quite short. A lot of them are less than 10 pages. So you apply that to Feast for Crows, there's no chapters, I think, in Feast for Crows that are less than 10 pages. So yeah, but before we get into the video, if you guys did want to become a Patreon or a member, consider doing those. You get videos early, and I'm doing all of my House of the Dragon content for exclusive members for my reviews and things like that. But let's get into the video. So as you guys have known, I've been doing a reread for the past year, 7 months. Every week I've been kind of writing down my thoughts for each of the chapters and ranking them, so it's all kind of fresh in my mind, and it's not like I'm retroactively doing it by the end of the book. So yeah, this has been a process that I've been planning to make this video for a very long time. So let's just start out with 73, the lowest rated chapter to me of Game of Thrones. I had Bran 3 a Game of Thrones. I think the chapter just doesn't fit the book tonally. It just feels out of place. It feels like the black sheep of the book. It's not to say it's a bad chapter necessarily. I think it's hurt because it's in this book specifically, because the idea with the three-eyed crow and Bran's third eye being awakened doesn't really bear fruit in this book. It's not a main focus of this book until maybe like the last chapter or 2, and then it's a huge focus of A Clash of Kings. So it's in Bran 3, so very early on in the book, right? It's before Ned really gets to King's Landing. But at the same time, it doesn't really get addressed. It doesn't particularly go anywhere until either the very end of the book or the next book. So it just doesn't really have any consequence in this book. It doesn't feel natural, given how we're kind of focused more in reality for most of this book. There's not really any type of magic in this book at all, outside of maybe Jon's plot line. It just feels out of place. So I gave it a 6.9 out of 10, which is my lowest by far of this book. So yeah, a lot of things kind of go into it, right? Some of the stuff I talked about, but also the book. This chapter is extremely short. It's this, I think, the shortest chapter of the book, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe it's tied. Very small chapter. Not a chapter that really fit for me. I know a lot of you guys really like Bran 3. It's just not my cup of tea personally. Number 72, I have Arya 1, A Game of Thrones. So as you guys can tell, I think a lot of the chapters at the beginning of the book are some of the weaker ones because a lot of them are just very quick. They don't stay very long. Arya 1 is only 7 pages long. That's very short for a chapter. So not a lot truly happens in this chapter. It's why a lot of it isn't really even adapted in Game of Thrones, the TV show. Like, part of the first half of this is just Arya and Sansa doing needlework, and it's to kind of establish the differences between the two characters, how Mordain doesn't treat Arya the best, giving favoritism towards Sansa, and all of that. And, you know, Myrcella's here as well, and so Arya gets embarrassed in front of Myrcella. And then the second half is much more interesting, where, you know, you have her dynamic with Jon, which is kind of introduced here as well. And we see Robb and Joffrey kind of have like a bit of a little standoff, building the two characters going forward in the book. But, you know, again, Arya 1 I have is a 7.7 out of 10. I thought it was a solid chapter to begin Arya's arc in the book, but just wasn't very long. Not a lot happens in terms of plot. A lot of the dynamics that we see with characters kind of get established, you know, a little bit later on anyway. So it just kind of feels like an inconsequential chapter in the grand scope of all the chapters in this book. That's kind of why I have it down here at 72. Number 71, another one I think you guys might be surprised on, because again, like I said, a lot of the beginning chapters are kind of at the lower part of the book, or the lower part of my rating, because they just take a little bit of time to get going, and they are all very short. So Tyrion 1, A Game of Thrones, I gave a 7.8 out of 10. It's number 71. I just think, again, it's only 8 pages long. It's one of those where not much really happens. It's not even really like a purely Tyrion introduction chapter, because I feel like Tyrion's introduction chapter is really in Jon's first chapter. But here we see mainly like Tyrion, you know, waking up and figuring out, you know, what happened to Bran, and talking to Joffrey and the Hound. And then he's talking with the Lannister family. So it's kind of our introduction into those characters through a non-Stark eye. And it's dealing with the fallout of Bran's fall. It's nothing crazy. It doesn't do a lot for Tyrion's character. It kind of maybe builds his dynamic with his siblings. Maybe a little bit of his dynamic with Joffrey, as we're not going to see any of these characters kind of together outside of Tyrion 1 until book 2. Just not a lot really happens. It's just kind of one of those early building block chapters. Number 70, I have Bran 1, A Game of Thrones. I gave it an 8 out of 10. Now, you guys might be thinking, this is the second chapter of the book. It's an iconic chapter. I think the reason I have it down here is because in terms of the enjoyment of the chapter, Bran is almost like Areo Hoda in Dorne, for instance, because Bran doesn't have a personality in this chapter. He doesn't really have anything interesting about him. Like, out of all of the POVs at the very start, he's the one that gets the least amount of development. And so what we really end up seeing with Bran 1 is it's trying to introduce a lot of main characters right away. And so Bran gets pushed to kind of the wayside, right? Because it's, you know, him, you know, watching Ned do his actions. We're learning more about Ned through Bran's eyes than we are Bran about Bran. We're learning about Robb and Jon's dynamic, whether it's Jon giving Bran advice, or whether it's Robb and Jon talking about the execution that goes on, whether it's, you know, Ned talking to Bran about why he had to kill the man, whether it's, you know, the stuff with the wolves and getting all the wolves, and Jon and Robb's kind of rivalry, but also then Theon's in there. So there's just a lot going on in this chapter. And again, it is a very short one, but we don't learn anything about Bran. Like, there's nothing about him that comes off here that's compelling. Like, all we know about Bran in this first chapter is he's a younger son of Ned who is trying to become a man, I guess, based upon, you know, watching this and trying to learn and instill those values onto Bran. But Bran himself has no distinct character arc, or no distinct, like, building block of the character in his first chapter, whereas others do, right? Arya's dynamic with Sansa, Arya with Jon, all of that is building who the character of Arya is and focusing on her. Jon's first chapter is a focus on him as a character. The only other character that I think in their first chapter has a big lack of, you know, direction on who they are as a character, a foundation for their character, is Tyrion, which is why I have it a little bit low, because Bran actually has more plot relevant things going on in his first chapter than Tyrion does. But I think Bran 1 is one that you could really convince me maybe otherwise, because I'm looking at it distinctively from Bran as a POV. I just find that the stuff going on in the chapter is interesting, but the character giving us that information is not very interesting in this first chapter. That's not to say Bran's bad in this book, but definitely the early chapters are a struggle for Bran. Number 69, nice, is Jon 2. I do like this chapter, even though it is, only 6 to 7 pages, so it's very, you got to take it with a grain of salt. There's not a ton here. But what I love about the chapter is, I guess, the interactions between Jon and Catelyn and Arya. And so it's one of those chapters where you are kind of viewing a goodbye, right? Where it's Jon saying goodbye to all of these people that we may not see for books and books and books from this moment, or we may never see them again. And whether it's Jon and Robb or Jon and Catelyn, there's still a chance we could see Jon and Catelyn, but seems not likely at this point It seems not likely at this time. And so I think the really big thing that holds this chapter down is, for one, it doesn't have a ton of impact on the plot and the story of this book, right? It's just a goodbye and all these things. And so in retrospect, it's like, it's not as consequential as a lot of Jon's chapters are in the future. And so this one, to me, I think has the least amount of consequence on the book, while also being extremely short. The one big thing of note from the chapter is it is building on like Jon's background, his dynamic with Catelyn, and how that's going to motivate him going forward, and how it's going to haunt him. The abuses, it seems like he's gone through. I know people like to argue with me, but I think personally it seems very likely that Jon was probably like verbally abused from Catelyn, just seen based upon their interactions. But who knows? That gets us in a number 68, Bran 2, A Game of Thrones, 8.1 out of 10. Yeah, I've been very harsh on Bran to start out this, because his opening 3 chapters I don't find as that compelling. But in this, again, chapter, it's 11 pages. And the thing is, right, in this chapter, it's kind of the tale of 2 stories. The beginning is pretty dull. The only thing we get for the first half of the chapter is, Bran has a couple characteristics, and that's about it. He wants to be a knight, and he likes to climb. That's really all Bran has going for him in this second chapter. And it's especially annoying given Bran has 2 chapters this early in the story, and he still isn't a compelling character. He doesn't have anything really interesting about him at this point. Whereas if we had other characters that had those things, right? If Arya had 2 POV chapters at Winterfell, that will go a long way, right? She only ends up having 1. Sansa herself doesn't even have a POV chapter at Winterfell. And even in her first chapter, which doesn't even come till the Trident, she's in a far better spot in terms of the building block of the character than Bran is. So you have the first part of it, which is just Bran climbing and, all this stuff. And I even said it, right? If I was rating just the first half of this chapter, it would be in the 6 out of 10 range. The first half of this chapter is just not good. Where it gets interesting is, once again, the problem with Bran earlier in these books is when you finally get to the ending with other characters. It's other characters that Bran is getting to watch that are far more interesting than Bran himself. So we see Jaime and Cersei. So through Bran, he doesn't really know what's happening, but through us, it looks like, Jaime and Cersei are having sex. And this thing where Bran, was listening in on the conversation between the 2 characters is great, because it builds what we're going to see with Ned having to deal with going forward. And then Bran himself getting pushed out of the window is an amazing moment, right? It's like, whoa, Bran just got pushed out of the window. The problem with it is, if you're a first-time reader, you're not going to have that much of an emotional connection to Bran, because Bran is barely a character as it is. All you're really caring about is, yes, he's a kid, and he just innocent, and he just got pushed out of a window, which is insane. But Bran himself has no real emotional ties to us at this point. So that's where I put Bran 2. Bran has 3 chapters in the very bottom of this. Not a good look. Why he's my least favorite POV of the book. But still, let's move on. Number 67 I have is Catelyn 1, A Game of Thrones, an 8.2 out of 10. A very short chapter. That's why it's here. It gets right to the point. It doesn't overstay its welcome, but it also kind of leaves a little bit to be desired. But we get a lot of great world building. We finally kind of really explore the dynamic between Ned and Catelyn. It really sets up their characters and plots for the entire book. It also includes some great foreshadowing in the Godswood, because this chapter's main focus is just to tell Ned Jon Arryn has died and that Robert's coming. That's basically what this chapter is. That one scene in the first episode of A Game of Thrones that's like less than a minute and a half, 2 minutes long, that's this chapter. So that's why it's kind of down here. It's like it's good for building up, that dynamic between characters and giving us a building block of Catelyn, but it doesn't really go far further than that. It's just a nice opening chapter. Number 66 I have is Tyrion 3, A Game of Thrones, an 8.3 out of 10. This chapter is mainly a focus between Tyrion and the officers of Castle Black as they beg him for help at the wall because they're undermanned. And following this, we see Tyrion experience the wall one more time as he'll be leaving the next day. We see our last meeting between Jon and Tyrion, which is the highlight of the chapter. I think the best part of Tyrion and Jon's arcs through the early parts of the book is their kind of conversations with each other, in which they seem to have one in every single chapter that they're in almost. But I will say, the reason I think this chapter's so low is because it lacks any of the stakes of a lot of the chapters above, right? It's like Tyrion and Jon's last meeting. Out of all of the different conversations that they do end up having, this is the one with the least amount of consequence. It doesn't really have like this lingering effect on Jon like maybe some of the other chapters do that the two are in together. And so this one, it's like a bittersweet ending with Jon and Tyrion. We won't see them together for a long time. If Jon even comes back in Winds of Winter, who knows if George will switch that up, which probably won't. But still, it's one of those where it's like, yeah, it's a fine chapter. It's a good chapter, but it's not anything crazy. Moving on, we have 65 being Jon 1, A Game of Thrones. And this one is exactly here because of what I just talked about. It has more of an impact on Jon as a character than, say, Tyrion's last chapter was, because it's more of an impact on Jon's character at the end than it is for anything for Tyrion. And Jon 1, again, is another quick chapter. It's only 8.5 pages long, but what we do get here is pretty quality development for Jon. He has a decent start for him in book 1, where, it's him at this dinner, more or less. And so he's been placed not with his family, but at kind of the back of the hall, being hidden away. You really feel Jon's feelings towards, why he wants to go to the wall. It's him becoming drunk for the first time. It's kind of him talking with Benjen. It almost feels like Benjen is kind of manipulating Jon in a way for the wall. And it's all this different stuff because Jon mentions on an offhand comment while drunk that he wants to go to the wall, and that's the justification for him being sent there later on by, Catelyn and Luwin. It is interesting because also then Benjen's the one that tells Luwin this information. It is a weird chapter in retrospect when you think about some of the motives going on. But then we also get the best part of the chapter, which is Tyrion and Jon. And, their conversation has rippling effects for both the two characters. In a lot of ways, Jon 1 is really also Tyrion 1. I know Tyrion 1, he has his own chapter, but it doesn't do as much to his character as much as the last part of this with Jon does. And that's the one thing I struggle with Tyrion in the early parts of the story, is he is never a character that seems to be focused on building up his character. Every chapter, he feels like he is being used to build up other characters' stories. And so that is kind of the same here, except Tyrion's quote about how you shouldn't, shirk away from what people are calling you. For instance, Jon's being called a bastard. He should use that as armor, right? So it can never be used against you. Tyrion uses his own advice as well throughout the story. He lets people believe he's this monster and all these things, and it blows up in his face in Storm of Swords because everybody kind of just hates him. And it's because he's doing this persona. Jon, in a different way, is kind of taking it a little bit more positively, right? He starts to learn to not be offended when people call him Lord Snow, for instance, and all these things. So I think it's a good chapter for both Tyrion and Jon, but just not as, I guess, consequential. It doesn't have huge ramifications in the plot or anything like that. Just a good starting point for the two characters that's better than most characters' starting points. So, Tyrion 2, another one where not a lot happens in the story, but it just boils down to a conversation between Jon and Tyrion. talking about Jon's, journey to the Wall, what that's going to be like, how people haven't really told him the truth of the Wall and the people that he's going to be serving with. It's this idea of, Tyrion, what is his mind, needing, right? What is his use to House Lannister? How does he feel that he is, trying to ably help his family? I think it's great because it deals with some interesting, themes for both the characters of Jon and of Tyrion, and kind of gives us a little bit of foreshadowing as to what is to come. But again, there's not really much that happens in terms of the plot outside of they left Winterfell and they are journeying to the Wall. Not a lot really happens, but I do think that here is one of the better conversations and interactions between all of the early ones between Tyrion and Jon. So I feel like this one, to me, I put a little higher because of some of the things that we get in this chapter compared to other ones in the past. So number 63 is Ned 5, A Game of Thrones. I gave this one an 8.4 out of 10. I think it's probably the weakest of the Ned chapters, as it's, it's showing Ned investigating Jon Arryn's death and how he knows something is up. We see him questioning Pycelle and mistrusting him, and this is kind of following a great conversation with Arya about her concerns with her future, and lastly, it's followed by Ned and Littlefinger talking about leads on Jon Arryn's death. So again, we get some interesting stuff here, with like different plot lines, and they're still in their earlier phases. This definitely feels like one of the bridge chapters of the Ned King's Landing plot, where it's kind of putting a lot of seeds into the story, which are going to bloom later on. It just kind of is definitely paling in comparison to most of Ned's chapters in the book. And so the best parts of this are kind of Ned and Littlefinger and kind of teaching him about the game and that he's being spied on and that he should trust no one. So there's that interesting dynamic there that's going to come up to, the surface later on in the story. And it's kind of just introducing us into the mystery plot of Jon Arryn and what happened at King's Landing. But I do think out of all the Ned chapters, it is probably my least favorite. So number 62 is Catelyn 4, A Game of Thrones, and I gave it an 8.5 out of 10. Again, I think Catelyn 4 is a interesting chapter, but it has a lot it has to do. It's our first chapter in King's Landing, and it does do a really good job of establishing what Ned is walking into, but it makes it feel like it's kind of a prelude chapter. It's a prelude into the Ned Stark, main plot line of the book, so it doesn't really have like that punch of what we see later on. But what it does have, which is great between that and also the spy game, because Catelyn in this is very interesting in terms of the decisions she makes, how she gets so exposed so quickly. It shows that Catelyn is not the best politician at times. She doesn't understand exactly how to do things. And it shows kind of the weaknesses that Catelyn will have throughout the series in terms of political and logical decisions. But it also shows us a little bit of that relationship between Catelyn and Littlefinger, and also introduces us into Varys. Again, this chapter has a lot it has to introduce, and so it kind of can feel, I don't know, overwhelming, I think, on a first read. You're getting major characters thrown at you like Littlefinger and Varys right before the story is going to really kick off with Ned getting there. It has to introduce the main capital of the city and the castle that Ned's going to be in from the entire rest of the story. It has a lot to do. And so at times it feels like we never truly get enough time to focus on one individual idea. We get thrown a lot of different ideas at us. And on a reread, that's fine, right? Because you completely understand what's going to happen in the story and all of that, and you can take it in a bit more. But I do think, on a first reread, or on a first read especially, this could be one of those really jarring chapters because Catelyn's moving around, right? I think I really like Catelyn 3 and Catelyn 4. By the time we get to that, she's all the way in King's Landing already. So, it is what it is. But it does introduce the idea, and one of the main central plots of the book, who sent, this cat's paw that tried to kill Bran, and whose dagger was it? And so the thing we get here is that it is Tyrion. And us, the audience, are sitting here going, that doesn't seem right. We like Tyrion with Jon at this point. So far, Tyrion seemed like a good character. And so it sets some of the groundwork for what we're going to see later on with Tyrion being captured by Catelyn. But yeah, it is a lot of different things being thrown at you. And so I think the way it introduces those things, or George introduces those things, is not as good as it could have been, but I still think it's a very good chapter. So Sansa's lowest chapter. I talk about this a lot with Sansa. I know a lot of people don't like Sansa, especially in book 1. I think Sansa's just a very mid POV in this book. I think all of her chapters are kind of in a certain range, right? Where she's kind of in that like 60 to 30 range where all of her chapters are. She doesn't have any chapters that are like right there at the bottom, but she doesn't have any chapters that are like at the top. So she's just kind of in the middle, right? When you read this POV, you know nothing crazy is going to happen. It's going to be a fine chapter. It's not going to be a terrible chapter or anything, but it's just going to be of a certain quality. And that's kind of how Sansa is in this book. But Sansa 3, A Game of Thrones, I give it an 8.5 out of 10. It's an extremely short chapter. Again, I am going to rate usually short chapters kind of low unless they really progress the plot in those, couple pages, because those couple pages it's going to be difficult for you to develop a character. So moving into this chapter, all we really see is this idea where Arya and Sansa are basically told that they're going to be going back to Winterfell. And it's a big chapter for other characters, in my opinion. It's things that like aren't going to happen in this chapter, but are important for other ones. So it's really weird because it does progress the story, but none of it happens in this chapter, if that makes sense, right? Like, think about the big things that come of this chapter, because, Sansa obviously does not want to leave she does obviously not want to leave King's Landing, right? So she is really, distraught by this, and so we're going to see her go to Cersei. That doesn't happen in this chapter. We're also going to see Ned, because of the way Sansa talks about Joffrey not being anything like Robert. That's going to be the thing that is eventually going to lead to Ned then realizing, wait a second, Joffrey isn't actually Robert's. That happens in the next Ned chapter. So nothing truly happens in this. Like, there's not a lot that actually happens outside of things being set up for other events. So this is almost a purely a setup chapter. And also it's hard to kind of, stomach this chapter because Sansa acts horribly to Arya the entire chapter, like 90% of it. It's Arya apologizing to Sansa, but then Sansa will still like be really upset at Arya and treat her terribly. And so it feels like one of these chapters that's a great reintroduction into Sansa, because Sansa 2 and Sansa 3 are very far apart, right? Like Sansa 2 takes place during the Hands tournament, right? And Sansa 3 takes place like right before Ned, tells Cersei what he knows. That's like maybe like a little before the half of the book to like 2/3. Like, that's a very big range of where we are in terms of chapters. Like, Sansa definitely has more chapters at the very end of the book than she does in the first half. And so it feels like one of those chapters where it is important, but it isn't important for this Sansa POV. Like it's a setup chapter, more or less, and reintroducing Sansa as she has more like time going on later on. Next up, I have number 60 being Ned 9. I gave it an 8.5 out of 10. Again, another short chapter. It's only 6 pages long, and what we get in it is pretty good. But I think comparatively to the chapters above it, this chapter does not have as much of like the consequence, or I feel like this chapter just lacks some of the things that I think are more impactful in other chapters. And I think the other part of it is that when you think about the Ned and Jaime face-off in the show, I actually like that face-off much better in the show than I do in the book. In the book, it's still good, but it's extremely short, and it isn't as interesting. It's still good, but in terms of what makes Ned so interesting, it's a lot about like his beliefs when those are tested and put into these places. This chapter, all we see is Ned discovering Robert's child in the brothel. We get some lore dumps into Lyanna as a person and Maya Stone being Robert's bastard. But the real big part of this chapter, why it's higher than some of the chapters below it, is the final face-off, where we see Jaime and Ned's conflict. Again, it's the repercussions of the actions Catelyn has taken so far with capturing Tyrion. And we see the death of Jory. And Jory's not that big of a character at this point of the story. Again, he's only been referenced, a couple times here and there. Doesn't have a distinct personality, whereas like the show gave Jory a couple more scenes, here and there, or giving Jory, the place of other like guards so that he has more screen time that makes his death a little bit more impactful. And so, yeah, it's like, okay, Jory dies, some of his men die, that's kind of sad, but the big part of it is, Ned gets injured, right? Ned seems to be in a really bad spot, and you're not clear if Jaime's going to kill him or not, and Jaime just kind of leaves. So we don't see a kind of a sword fight off between Jaime and Ned. Jaime just kind of leaves, not like in the show. It's definitely good, but it's not as important as I think other Ned chapters are in this book. Chapter 59 is going to be Ned 6, an 8.5 out of 10. This chapter is pretty much a prelude to the upcoming King's Tourney. I do like the small council, with Janos Slynt asking for men and Renly jesting about it. It's a quality, small council chapter is really what it is, right? We get all these different characters talking about, different things going on in the world with stuff on Stannis, what he was doing with Jon Arryn, Ned following a lead and finding Gendry. It's just kind of one of those middle of the ground, building up into the mystery, building up to some of the big points going forward. But it definitely isn't one of those big chapters by no means. I think it's better than Ned 9 though, because we get more into the character work of a lot more characters than just, for instance, like Ned and Jaime in that chapter. And Ned doesn't really even get anything. It's really just Catelyn's consequences, like what, she's done. And so it's more about, I guess, Jaime and his relationship with Tyrion than it is anything about Ned. And so in Ned 6, it's a bit more, right? It's us starting to unravel things. Why were Stannis and Jon Arryn spending significant amount of time together? Why is Gendry the one that they were going to? And it's because he's a bastard. And you're starting to unravel all these things. For me personally, I just find it a bit better than Ned 9. We have another Ned chapter right after. But Ned 4. And this chapter is Ned's first in King's Landing. And I gave this another 8.5, but it's a better small council meeting than the number 59, right? As we're seeing how ineffective Robert's rule has been, the kingdom is bankrupt. And Robert himself isn't even attending, it seems like, meetings. We're doing this tournament that we can't afford. All of this is going right in the face of what Ned believed was going on, right? How is Jon Arryn allowing this to happen? Ned is already, dealing with having to, kill Lady, and already the rivalries between the Lannisters and Starks are growing. And then you have this stuff where you're learning things are in a much worse spot than you thought they were. We see Ned and Littlefinger interacting, and more of that dynamic foreshadowing Littlefinger's inevitable betrayal. And they go to see, Catelyn, right? Seeing Ned and Catelyn, it's their last meeting. It has a lot of weight on the story as, Ned tells her a lot of things to prepare the North for war. It's only Ned 4, and he's already thinking about what's eventually going to come to this being war. And again, the only reason I have it lower than other chapters is because it does lack some of the weight of other chapters above it. But I do think this is a good chapter. I think a lot of things are really established well, because this, in a lot of ways, is the beginning of the King's Landing arc for Ned. Because theoretically, you could say the beginning of the King's Landing arc was with Catelyn and in her last chapter, the one we've already talked about in this ranking. But this is really where things get kickstarted, and you really get the feel, the atmosphere of what Ned's walking into, that everything around Ned is quite literally the polar opposite of who Ned is as a character. And so, yeah, I think great chapter from Ned. I just think there are just better ones from Ned in this book. So, number 57, Jon 5, A Game of Thrones, which I gave an 8.6. I do think this is a very underrated chapter. I think, Jon didn't get his moment in the show where he could show off how clever he was. I think a lot of us book readers have a bit of a issue with how Jon was portrayed in the show. And this is one of those reasons, right? Because this chapter is almost plainly about how, okay, all these people are going to be put into the Night's Watch, right? They've been moved on, right? Which is interesting. And you see Jon, realizing what his role is going to be, right, as he's working through becoming a steward. But the big part of it is, Sam. Jon realizes that Sam is acting weird because he realizes that he's going to have no one left to protect him. Everybody else is moving on. They're going to go to Eastwatch maybe, or they'll go to the Shadow Tower, or they'll be doing this duty, and it won't allow them to spend time with Sam. And so Jon realizes that Sam could be easily killed because they're not there to protect him from Thorne. And so he goes to Aemon in the middle of the night, and this is what comes back up in the opening of Storm of Swords, where he tries to get Sam a job to help Maester Aemon, because Sam's best qualities are, he's good with animals, he's able to read and write better than anyone because he was highborn, he's great at that, right? He's gonna be great at helping Maester Aemon. And Aemon allows for Jon to convince him, right? So Jon tells him that every man has their uses. Already the Night's Watch is underused, but he gives a lesson that Luwin talked about, right? That everybody has their own use, that everyone has their own skill set. Why waste it? And that's what convinces Aemon to kind of have, Sam go through and be part of the stewards and be helping him, right? It's a really great chapter because it shows the bond that Jon and Sam have made, but it also shows the growth of Jon, right? It's like a nice middle of the ground chapter for Jon, in the book, because it's going from Jon, who viewed everybody as being kind of beneath him, being lesser than him because he could best them in sword fighting. They were all criminals. And it shows you that dynamic where Jon has kind of turned a corner a little bit and he's starting to mature a bit. And so I like it. It's a nice middle of the ground, Jon 5, right around the middle of the book. I really do enjoy this chapter. Just doesn't have the weight of, I think, a lot of Jon's chapters going forward. 56, in my opinion, is Bran's first really good chapter in this book. Again, I think every chapter now, going from, like, I would say even when I started talking about Ned's chapters in the last couple ones, all these could be mixed around, right? You could put these anywhere. I think some of these chapters may have a higher, placement for you, and that's because you have a preference for them. All these chapters are good, I think, from here and kind of beyond. But so Bran 4, Game of Thrones, is an 8.6 for me, but it focuses heavily on, Bran and Robb. This is the first chapter where I really feel like we start to get notable development for Bran, and also we get a lot of development for Robb. We specifically focus on two central issues in this chapter. Bran's life after losing the use of his legs, and Robb stepping up and becoming the Lord. Remember, Catelyn has gone down south, so Robb has to step up, right? And so we see that Bran, in this chapter, is struggling with his life. He feels alone. He feels abandoned. There is no one that has time for him anymore, as his mother is gone, his father's gone, his sisters are gone. Robb has to be the Lord. Everything seems like it's kind of falling apart for Bran, and his life is falling apart. While on the flip side of them in this chapter, you have Robb, who is struggling with ruling. He's too young to be doing this stuff, right? I think Robb could have expected not having to do any of this stuff until he's at least into his 20s, and now he's having to rule, Winterfell in the north at the age of 14. Like, that is an insane feat. And so it really starts to spill over on him, right? That pressure grows. But we also see into even all of that, you have another part of this where Tyrion comes in as well. And he arrives at Winterfell, and there's a great scene foreshadowing future conflicts between the Lannisters and the Starks, where the wolves seem to just kind of attack Tyrion. Even when Robb didn't even want them to. They just seem to go wild, to a sense that the Lannisters are not their friends, even though Tyrion might be their friend. His dynamic between giving and helping Bran, because he also feels what Bran feels, that disability and how people view disability in this world. But the best part of it, and one of my favorite moments of the entire book, is definitely the last scene with Robb and Bran. It's a really touching moment where you see the two kind of embracing, and Bran's been questioning Robb because there's the Robb the Lord and Robb his brother. And he sees that that's taking a toll on his brother, and Robb and Bran embrace, with Robb having tears in his eyes. It's a great moment. It's a great moment given where we know Robb's going to go in the future, especially in this book. And it's a chapter that I'd love to rate higher. It just doesn't have a lot of consequence. It doesn't have a lot of things going on, but it is really great for just the soul part of it, of character development. It's a very strong chapter for. So at number 55, I have Arya 2. This chapter is not a massive one story-wise, but this is a major chapter for Arya's development. We see her feeling guilty and alone after Micah's death and the events of the Trident. She blames herself and hates herself. Her conversation with Ned in this chapter really shows how close they are and make the death of Ned even more tragic later on. Also, we have Arya's first lesson with Syrio, which is super impactful to her arc. Overall, again, the discount of this chapter is it's not huge in terms of the story or the arching narrative, but it's very huge for Arya as a character development chapter because we haven't seen Arya in a POV since Winterfell. right? We don't see her through the entire journey as a POV. We see her through other people's eyes, but not a POV. And you come back to this character and she's deeply distraught. And it's one of those things that, you know, looking at Arya in the future, she grows from. This is one of those most important chapters for Arya going forward. But in the grand scheme of things, I don't think it's the biggest chapter. Number 54 is Sansa 1, A Game of Thrones. I gave it another 8.6 out of 10. Same with Arya 2, if I didn't say the rating for that. But this chapter is a lot about developing Sansa and, again, her relationship with Arya. Because we haven't seen Sansa yet, right? So we're just now, if you're thinking about getting to Sansa at the Trident, right? We don't see Sansa at Winterfell. And so there's a lot to develop here in terms of how Sansa views the world. And definitely the highlights of this chapter is, you know, her being introduced into the Hound and her, you know, seeing for the first time, we're seeing them in the book, Renly and Barristan, two huge characters in the way that they are distinctively described. She eventually gets to go on her date with Joffrey, which is crucial to how the story functions for Sansa. But it ends with, again, the attack on Arya and Arya fighting back. It's one of the huge climaxes of the early part of the book, one of those big moments. And my only negative on it, and this is what I wrote down, if only it wasn't a Sansa POV, right? Sansa is just a character that is very hard to root for. You can understand the character to rationalize her things and all that, but unfortunately, she's just not the most interesting POV. I think if Arya was the POV of this chapter, this section of the story, I think it probably would have been a lot higher on my rating, but because it was Sansa, I did kind of put it down a little bit. She's just not as interesting to read, especially on a reread as someone like Arya. Number 53 is Jon 3, A Game of Thrones. I gave it an 8.7 out of 10. This chapter is Jon's first one at the wall. We really see Jon adjusting to life, and at the wall, what it's going to be like. The people that he's with, a lot of them are criminals or accused criminals. He's looking down on everyone else, thinking he is better than everyone. And so we get this moment with Danelle Noy, which is something that the show kind of took when it gave it to Tyrion. But I love that this is the turning point for Jon's character, right? It's this moment where Jon now starts to understand other people more than himself, right? He understands that these people have never held swords in their lives. These people, you know, may have been starving, may have been this or that, and that led them to do actions because they were really desperate. We see Jon have to realize, you know, through all of his, you know, training, you know, and his learning with Ned on how to be a man, there were other parts of it as well, and understanding people. But he also continues his conversations with Tyrion. I love, you know, his dynamic and friendship between the two. It's where I think Jon and Tyrion's arc early on, I think, is at probably its best, in my opinion. But I do definitely enjoy it. And it all kind of culminates in Jon meeting Commander Mormont, telling him that Bran has awoken, and also Jon apologizing to Grenn and tries to help him. It's a really nice character arc, because really the character arc for Jon is, you know, he has a character arc from Jon 1 to Jon 3, and then Jon 4, you know, towards when he learns about, you know, Ned's imprisonment stuff. That's when the next arc kind of starts. So I think a really good, solid middle ground Jon chapter. Definitely one of the better ones of the early book. But yeah, moving on, we have Catelyn 6. This chapter is just huge. For my longest analysis of the first half of the book, you can really feel that, in my opinion. This is a chapter that I do like. It just seems to go on for too long, right? I love seeing that we get Catelyn arriving at the Bloody Gate and her journey, but her journey to the Eyrie is just too long. It feels almost like 2 chapters combined into one, because George needed to do a lot in this chapter. He needed Catelyn and Lysa's conversation at the end for Ned's next chapter, right? They needed that conversation. And the pacing is really my only issue with what we actually get, right? It just feels are at a very slow pace in terms of when Catelyn and Maya Stone go up to the Eyrie. And so we do get a lot of good stuff, right? We develop and meet new characters like the Blackfish, Lysa, Maya Stone. We get a lot of the information of how the Vale works, how difficult, you know, it would be to even siege the Eyrie at all, or even attack it based upon all these, you know, geographical, you know, problems you would have in terms of the terrain and all of that, which is very interesting. But yeah, this chapter takes a backseat on Catelyn's development and just kind of lets the world build. Also, I did give that chapter an 8.8 out of 10. Number 51, and this is the lowest ranked Daenerys chapter. That should tell you how much I like Daenerys in this book. But Daenerys comes in at 51 with Dany 6 at Game of Thrones, an 8.8 out of 10. This is a very hard chapter for me to rank because it has some highs and some lows, right? It's a very inconsistent chapter because in a lot of ways this chapter is dealing a lot with the fallout of Viserys, right? This is the chapter right after Viserys dies. So a lot of the interesting dynamic, right, with Viserys and Daenerys is kind of gone. So this is really about recontextualizing, refocusing where Daenerys is going to go with the last half of her arc. And so, you have her thinking about Viserys, thinking about him being the last Targaryen, and we see how his death has maybe taken a toll on her. Yes, that relationship may have fallen apart, and Viserys might have deserved to die based on his actions, but it still puts a heavy pressure on Daenerys, where she realizes, she is the last Targaryen in her eyes. And so you also have her worrying about, her child, becoming more aware that she's carrying this child and how that affects her. And we see all of the things that we talk about with Ned and Robert, right? We won't actually talk about their, decision on whether to kill Daenerys or not for a while. It's one of my favorite chapters of the entire story. But we see the repercussions of that, right? Daenerys is just trying to have a nice time in the markets, and she has an assassination attempt on her, right? They try to poison her and kill her and her child. And we see Jorah figuring this out, but the suspiciousness of Jorah, right, as he's kind of off the screen. He really doesn't want to see if he really doesn't want Daenerys to come with him to check if he got any messages. And so you get to this point where it grows the plot of Jorah hiding something while also allowing Daenerys to kind of grow as a character in the post-Viserys part of her arc. But I think the big part of this chapter that holds it up, that keeps the pacing going for Daenerys, is the last part of the chapter. Daenerys has been trying to convince Drogo to go to Westeros to again claim the Iron Throne. And this is the thing that sparks it, right? Drogo is willing now to go to war. He gives this brutal and strong speech that Jason Momoa does a really good job of in the show. And it's just a big moment, right? Because where this is going now. Everything that Robert, might be fearing is really coming to fruition. Dany is trying to invade with the Dothraki, and that is where we kind of refocus Daenerys' plot and see how it's going to go when you go into a war-type situation with Daenerys and how that affects her as a person. Moving on, though, we have number 50, which is Daenerys 7. So Daenerys 7, following Daenerys 6, is slightly, I would say, it's either on par or just a little bit better. I just prefer it over Dany 6. But Dany 7 really is our first indication into what war is going to be like. We only see a couple instances of kind of the anti-war theme. It's not as present in this book as it is in the next couple books. But the first one we see here is Daenerys, right? We want her to take the Iron Throne and all this stuff, or maybe you don't at this point in the book, but Daenerys has tried to Daenerys is now trying to go back to Westeros and getting the Dothraki to take over Westeros. And so at this point, right, this is kind of the start of the final stretch of the book. And this one is kind of lower because it's kind of building up to the next things to follow, right? 8, 9, and 10 are all great chapters for Daenerys. And so Daenerys 6, it's kind of like the recontextualizing. Dany 7 is kind of building up now, right? We're taking that element of Dany 6 and we're building upon it. So what does this do, right? It's all about how the Lázarine people are being taken over by the Dothraki. Their people are being enslaved. Their homes are being destroyed. They're been burned. Their people are being killed. There are being, rapes happening all over the place. And it's how does Daenerys deal with these things, right? Because she has prompted this. They have to do this to be able to get ships, right? To either sell slaves or get boats to go to Westeros. They can't do that any other way. And so you're forcing, because you want this thing, that's your personal agenda, it's destroying all of these different lives. And so Daenerys is trying to be kind of a hero, trying to save these women from these horrible fates and all of this stuff. And all this chapter really highlights the anti-war theme beautifully. It's the strongest part of the chapter, right? And so when you look at that, because this chapter is, right before we get to kind of the Battle of the Green Fork with Tyrion, it paints exactly that image that you want to have going into that chapter. It's a great setup chapter for a lot of things to come, not only just Daenerys' plot. And that's why I think as a setup chapter, which a lot of these middle chapters, or a lot of this middle ranking, it's a lot of like your build-up chapters. It's going to be a lot of your setup chapters. And this is one of those ones that are really done well and that I really do enjoy. But the other part of it is, again, how Drogo gets injured during this battle and how that leads Daenerys trying to have Miri try and fix that. And we see that Miri seems to give Drogo good medical care, but Drogo's not going to take it in the next chapter. So it's, again, just building up things that will have consequences a little bit later on. Number 49, I have Ned 11, A Game of Thrones, another 8.8 out of 10. This is kind of one of those chapters in between, like, the endgame stuff for Ned, and it's also, like, in between the stuff where Ned has the Jaime scuttle. So you have this chapter in which we see Ned on the throne dealing with the issue in the Riverlands. It's a prelude to what we're really going to see with Catelyn's POVs later in the book, and to the wars coming in A Clash of Kings. And we see how Ned is shifting the blame of the war on the Lannisters. It's all about propaganda. It's all about painting the blame of things, right? It's about, putting the Lannisters in the position of blame and making them the bad guys of the situation. It's pretty good foreshadowing to the upcoming conflict because a lot of what we see in war is going to be about information, about propaganda. For instance, House of the Dragon, right? Jaehaerys' death, right? Aegon's son's death. Exact same idea, right? Paint the other side as the evil villains so you can get the common people on your side. It'll make making allies a lot easier if you're viewed as the good guys. And again, I just noted here, like, it's a fine and good chapter. It's just a middle chapter for Ned in terms of building up to the stuff going forward. It's a fine and good chapter, but nothing special, really taking it above other chapters kind of near it. I think it has more of an impact than, like, Daenerys 7 and 6. It's more interesting to read in terms of what's going on, the stakes that are building up, but I don't think it should be really any higher than number 49. Number 48, we have Jon 6. So I also made a mistake earlier on when I was talking about the chapter where Jon gets Sam into the stewards. I actually said something about Jon basically becoming placed in the stewards and all that. That actually happened in this chapter, not that one, so just take that out of what I said earlier. But we see that Jon is placed in the stewards and how he deals with that as he comes to the rationalization with Sam's help that Mormont is grooming him for command and what that actually means. He goes then to take his vows with Sam, but Ghost finds a hand. Again, it's another really good setup chapter for things moving forward. Nothing crazy in it, really just Sam realizing what his role is going to be moving forward and also setting up some of the White Walker attack that we're going to see in the next coming part of Jon's arc. Number 47, I have Bran 7, Game of Thrones, and I give it an 8.8 rating. Again, it's the final chapter for Bran, and it's a decent one. It connects back into kind of Bran 3. We start getting the magic side of Bran rolling, but it's a lot about this idea of Bran seems to have this dream that, his father is in the crypts, right? And that seems really off and weird because his father shouldn't be, right? For Bran's knowledge, right? Ned hasn't died. Us, the reader, we know Ned's already died. And so it's all about this idea of two contradicting ideologies, right? You have the Maester ideology with Luwin, who says, this isn't just magic, it's just some coincidence that you're having this dream, and Rickon having this dream and all that stuff. But then it's Osha, who has been north of the Wall, who has heard of the things that Bran's kind of talking about, wants to know more about, like the Children of the Forest. It's all about kind of building up Bran into a Clash of Kings, where that arc's going to go forward. But it's also a really sad end to Bran because we, the readers, as Bran is trying to rationalize through this and, thinking, his father maybe isn't dead, even though he feels in the back of his heart and his brain, it's us wanting him to be right, that Ned didn't actually die, but he did. And so when you have this debate, which almost feels like it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, we as the reader already know that Bran and Osha are pretty much correct based upon the fact that Ned's already dead, and both Bran and Rickon are seeing that. It's a really fascinating end for Bran. It doesn't have the heights, of course, of most of the other conclusions, but it's definitely a solid Bran chapter, and I really do enjoy it. It's not the best Bran chapter, in my opinion. I think there's other ones that are better, but it's definitely a good one. And so I put it around here at number 47 as a good kind of conclusion for Bran. Number 46, I have Catelyn 9, A Game of Thrones. Again, give it an 8.8 out of 10. This chapter just follows a lot of things, right? You know, you have Robb's campaign since leaving Moat Cailin. It's a fantastic introduction into the Freys and building the seeds of the Red Wedding. It also displays a bit of background for the Riverlands and their politics, as well as showing the growth of Robb accepting to marry a Frey girl to try and save his father. I think this chapter, the reason it's maybe lower, especially for being a late game chapter, is it just handles a lot of things, right? And it does handle those things well, but it's, again, a lot more of a setup chapter than it is like a payoff chapter. Because you got to remember, we're not going to see Walder Frey until the Red Wedding after this chapter, right? So we have got to build up the character of Walder Frey and the Freys as a whole pretty quickly. It's getting kind of thrown in there at the very end because that's going to establish the alliance between the Starks and the Freys. So that's all really great. The dynamic between Catelyn and Walder Frey is awesome. You know, seeing Robb continue to take steps as he's becoming more and more of a responsible man, even though he's not a man yet, right? He's still a young kid, right? He's still a young kid, but he's showing signs of a responsibility in trying to get his father back. Because at this point in the story, Ned is not dead yet, so he needs to take the fastest route possible. And so, again, another good setup chapter from Catelyn. But that gets us to number 45. Number 45 I have is Sansa 4, A Game of Thrones. Again, I give it an 8.8 out of 10. This chapter follows both Arya's escape and Ned's coup, and definitely has a different vibe. And it just, what Sansa is she's a more or less a contradiction to Arya, because Sansa feels more like an actual kid. Arya doesn't really seem to be a kid at all. She has a lot of adult-like ways that she's able to think and rationalize things, whereas Sansa doesn't. And so Sansa and Arya's like chapters after Ned's death are polar opposites, where Arya's seems like an Assassin's Creed type get out of, the Red Keep and try to escape the Lannister clutches. Sansa's is the opposite. Hers is this kind of overwhelming, maybe fear or stress in her stomach, as she was just simply left in a room. She was left in a room with Jane Poole, and she's trying to rationalize through this situation and how she's still very naive, and she is presented to the small council, and they go to work kind of manipulating her into writing letters and, trying to get her family to prevent and stop war for her father to live. The chapter is pretty solid. It isn't anything crazy in general. It's again, like I noted, it's a very middle of the pack chapter for this book. But it is a good moment where it's like Sansa really showing how she is as a character, still hasn't kind of fully realized what's going on, who these people of Cersei and Joffrey are, and that's going to kind of come to a front kind of at the end of the book. Number 44, I have another Sansa chapter, Sansa 2, A Game of Thrones, and again, I gave it an 8.8 out of 10 rating. This chapter is the first day of the Hand's Tourney, and so we get a lot of great building for kind of the atmosphere, right? Some of the famous knights in this world, seeing, Loras and others like that, seeing the Kingsguard. And we just see how young Sansa is. I talked about this with her last kind of chapter we just ranked, but she is still living in a fairy tale. She's not kind of grown up, even after the stuff with Lady, right? This is the next time we see her after the Trident. And so we see that she is someone that's blaming other people for what happened to Lady. She's not taking accountability, right? Where Arya is the opposite. She takes full accountability and maybe overdoes the accountability that she had in Lady's death and Micah's death. Sansa puts that onto other people, right? She puts that onto Arya. She puts that onto the Queen or whoever, or the King, right? And so we see all of that. We also do see that Sir Hugh, Ned's lead, dies. So that's kind of a big moment, connecting it to Ned and what's going on there. But we also see the second half of this chapter, right, where we see Sansa's on a date with Joffrey, and Joffrey's acting so great, but then it all kind of flips on its head when, she thinks Joffrey's going to take her back to the castle, but it ends up being the Hound. And so the Hound and Sansa kind of have this beginning of their kind of arc that will happen in Clash of Kings, where he's just kind of telling her, did you really think he was going to take you back? It should be this wake-up call for Sansa, but she can't see through the red flags, which you can't really blame her. I think a lot of us can relate to a relationship or something we were in where we had all the red flags there and we just didn't take them. And so you apply that to Sansa, who's even younger than probably when a lot of people started dating. So yeah, it's a very understandable chapter for Sansa. Definitely one of her better ones of the book. But let's continue on. Number 43 is Tyrion 4, A Game of Thrones. I gave this one, again, an 8.8 out of 10. A lot of these middle chapters are going to have kind of the same rating, but this chapter picks up right after Catelyn's capture. And I really like this chapter because it shows how Tyrion is very cunning and able to gain power, even in a position of being a prisoner. He's plotting doubt of guilt in Catelyn's mind, right? Because Catelyn thinks, oh yeah, Tyrion had this dagger, but any rational human being, if you kind of think through everything that's going on, right, you start to question it, right? Like, why would Tyrion bet against his brother Jaime? And all of that, right? We also see him like gaining a friendship with Bronn because he sees for the future that Bronn could be very important to, staying alive. But we see the mountain clans attacking, and as our first like real taste of any type of actual battle. There isn't much like combat we really see in this book outside of like the very much the climax, so the last like quarter of the book. But we do see a little bit of a skirmish here between the mountain clans and Catelyn's party, a little bit of the horrors of that battle. But we get a great little arc for Tyrion as he goes from hating Catelyn to saving her life in really one chapter, which is really interesting. But it's a really fun chapter for me. I really enjoy reading it, but it lacks the weight of other chapters above to be, I think, ranked any higher than where it is. I would say, though, if you look at Tyrion 4, I think it's the beginning of the best parts of Tyrion in this book because Tyrion takes a while to get going. And this is kind of starting, Tyrion becoming more of a predominant POV that we like to see going forward. Number 42, one of the only POVs outside of, like, I'd say Ned that escaped the curse of the early POVs being kind of is Daenerys. So I have at number 42, Daenerys 2, A Game of Thrones. Again, an 8.8 out of 10. And I enjoy this chapter a lot, right? It's because we get Daenerys at her wedding, and she's trying to, grow as a character. We haven't seen her character in a little while because it's kind of her overcoming her fears and leaning into her Targaryen side ever so slightly, right? Every time that she has this moment where she's in a great stress or she needs strength, she goes to, her dragon dreams. She goes to her lineage as a Targaryen. And it's a significant chapter in the early portion of the book. As Dany and Drogo are married, this will have big repercussions maybe for Daenerys' arc, and it could have on Westeros if things had gone a little bit differently. But also we see Daenerys receiving her dragon eggs, very crucial to the story as well. We see Viserys' continued hatred of the attention that Dany is getting. Again, just building up the character of Viserys and the dynamic between Daenerys and Viserys. I love this chapter for Daenerys, but what holds it back, in my opinion, from her first chapter, because I like her first chapter a bit better than her second chapter, is I find the ending with Drogo and Daenerys, where they're trying to consummate their wedding, is just weird. It's uncomfortable to read, and I think the show even took it to a different step, where they show Emilia Clarke or Daenerys being like basically raped. It's not a good look. The show did it even worse, in my opinion. But it's just very uncomfortable, and it brings the chapter down a little bit for me. Number 41, I have Jon 4, A Game of Thrones. Again, 8.9. I give it an 8.9. It's kind of that next slightly going up from where we were. In my opinion, this is by far Jon's best chapter early on. We see Jon has progressed as a person, helping the recruits, and now he actually has friends. But the big part of the chapter is his relationship with Samwell Tarly. This is where we meet Sam, and we're like going through this, and at first, Jon kind of does have pity on Sam, but he doesn't understand who Sam is. Very similar to what we just saw, right? Trying to understand these people and how they got to the wall, and maybe they had hard backgrounds, or they were criminals, whatnot. Or maybe they were alleged criminals, whatever. But when you get to Samwell is a character that you just don't understand. He's highborn, but he seems completely not fit for the wall. He's considered fat, which is not something that is like that well looked upon in this society, especially that, warriors of great strength are looked at, very highly. And also, you look at so many people that are starving, they're going to look at Sam and go, well, he's eating all this food and all this stuff. Why is that fair? So you look at Sam and us, the viewer and the reader, and we're going, what is making Samwell tick? Why is he here? And when you finally get this reveal by the end of the chapter, right, where Samwell Tarly is here because his father was willing to kill him for not fitting into a certain type of person. It changes the way you view him. You, with the character of Jon, you understand the character of Sam, and you like Sam. You understand him. If you're ever a person that's felt like you were disappointing, your parents or, a loved one, you really feel what Sam feels in that moment. And I think it's a powerful moment for the early part of the book because it introduces us into the main character outside of Jon in that arc. And it fulfills an interesting, character moment from beginning to end. It has a complex story. And so I really do enjoy this ranking for Jon. I think it's by far his best chapter of the early part of the story. And that gets us into number 40 is Tyrion 5, A Game of Thrones. This is where we're into a 9 out of 10 range. So again, these are A chapters and above. I think all these chapters are really good. I think a lot of them you could put in nearly any order. I don't think I have a problem with any of them. This is just how I see them. And so this is now we're halfway through the book, and Tyrion has yet to really get going. His 4th chapter started to really put him on that path where he would become more of an interesting and dominant POV. But this is the best chapter so far for Tyrion through the first half of the book. We see his incredible mind work as he manipulates Mord to do, the things he needs. He needs a message to be given to Lysa that he wants to confess. And we're seeing how he's manipulating events, how clever he can be. And so how he outwits Lysa in this meeting and declares for a trial by combat and even thinks on the spot, right? He's out here playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers, right? And he gets Bronn to then step up for him for the trial by combat. I love that, right? It does a really great job. I just think for me, it is a bit, to get going in the first half of the chapter, but when it gets going, it's a really good chapter. I enjoy it, and it really gives you that sense of Tyrion and Clash of Kings. So you guys might not like this rating. I don't know how people view the prologue of A Game of Thrones. For me, it's definitely in the upper half of the chapters, but it's one of those where, so let me just say it. At 39, I have the prologue, A Game of Thrones, 9 out of 10. I do think, right, the chapter is good. It's mysterious. It's one of the few moments we get any type of interaction with the others and try to, theory craft onto what they want and what they're about and how they interact with humans. And so it paints this eerie tone and feel for us. And it slowly introduces us into the world. And I like this chapter a lot because it does set the tone for some of the politics that's going to go on at the Wall. It's going to directly correlate to the Winterfell and the Ned plots at the very beginning of the book. It has a very, very dark ending, right? So to me, I think the first chapter is great. But in terms of at this point now, we're at the top 38, so we're at the top, really the top half of the coming chapters of the book. A lot of them just have huge emotional weight for characters going through the entire first book. I just can't put this chapter above a lot of those character moments for me, but I do recognize this is a great chapter, and I don't mind at all if you have it higher than I do. Number 38 is Dany 3. I love this chapter. I know I only have it at 38, but I really love this chapter. It takes everything that's been built up from Dany 1 and Dany 2, and it progresses Daenerys, right? We don't see, there's a decent amount of time that goes between Daenerys 2 and Daenerys 3. And so it feels like she builds off screen, and when you come back to the character of Dany 3 after her wedding, she's quite transformed, right? She's, growing into being a Khaleesi and becoming more confident with herself. She is someone that's, overcoming, the trials that it is to, be a Dothraki wife, to be a Khaleesi, having to ride, for hours and hours and hours, having to, have sex with Drogo every single night, it seems like. She is learning this new culture and new part of herself. And she is kind of starting to gain that power of being the Khaleesi. That isn't to say, again, she's fully there, because Dany never fully gets to where she needs to be as a character until the very last chapter of the book. But we're seeing those things taking effect, right? She's not letting Viserys, for instance, push her around, right? When she orders the Khalasar to stop and she wants to, ride off with Silver, her horse, Viserys is pissed off because who is she to order him around? And Daenerys doesn't take that. Daenerys punishes him for lashing out at her and trying to strike her in these things. And we then lead to the end of the chapter, which is another kind of sex ending, but it feels more impactful. There's more of a reason for it to be the way it is, because in the Dothraki culture, which shows Daenerys' awareness as going into this culture that you've now married into is very important, she leads Drogo in sex her own way. It's her taking more control, gaining more confidence, and having sex in the front of the Khalasar, the entire Khalasar, thousands of people. It's a huge moment for Dany in many ways because it has huge ramifications on where the character is going, and I really find it to be very impactful, an early chapter for Daenerys. Number 37 is Tyrion 6, A Game of Thrones. And I think this chapter is great for a number of reasons, right? You have the Tysha section of the story where we learn what happened with Tysha, that Tyrion was once married, and what became of that, what Tywin did, what Jaime said he did, what we know he didn't actually do. And so it's great because it motivates us to go, oh, wow, okay, now we understand Tyrion a lot. And we understand Tyrion and Tywin and their dynamic quite a lot. And there's a lot of foreshadowing here where Bronn says, I'd kill the man who did that. And Tyrion alludes that that may happen. So, there's a great dynamic between Bronn and Tyrion because we don't get the trial by combat for Tyrion through Tyrion's eyes. We get it through Catelyn's eyes. But it's great here because you can tell the dynamic between them is great. It's kind of like it is in the show. I think it's even more enhanced in the show than that dynamic. So you see Tyrion is also already plotting how they're going to get out of the Vale, right? He knows they are not going to be able to get past the Mountain Clans. They're going to have to make a plan to get through them, to gain an alliance with them. We see how all that plays out. Tyrion dealing with manipulating people. Also, I did want to point out, because I forgot to, I think, rate the chapters, but Daenerys 3 was a 9.3, and I give this chapter, Tyrion 6, a 9.4. And so I think the only reason I would say this chapter is lower, around the, middle of the pack, but on the upper side of it, around, being number 37, is just blatantly because I think of all of the POVs going on right now, I think Tyrion's still trying to grow to where other plots are at this point, right? Where, at this point of the story, Daenerys' plot has really kicked off, right? Ned's plot, right? We're getting to Ned's coup very shortly after this, part of the story for Tyrion. So there's a lot going on right now, and I think Tyrion kind of gets put down a little bit because he doesn't really come to the forefront until more of the end of the story, but definitely is a good building block for Tyrion. It has huge ramifications for going forward with his meeting with Tywin. So number 36, I have Sansa 5. This is a very weird chapter for me to rank because in terms of Sansa and her development, it's an average chapter. But in terms of what is going on in her POV, it elevates it quite a little bit, right? It slightly elevates it because there's a lot of cool things going on. We're seeing the Lannister regime take power, how differently that transforms the throne room. And this is the day Joffrey is kind of taking fealty and denouncing those who are, missing, like his uncles. But unfortunately, he and Cersei have Barristan released, which is one of the most badass scenes from the first season or the first book, where, you have Barristan just mocking them and leaving like a badass. But we see that kind of the change in the governance of the realm, right? It's that massive shift now that the Lannisters are in power. This is just a little taste of what Sansa is going to go with going forward. But also we see Sansa, right, having this really big, courageous moment where she has to beg for basically mercy. It's her understanding where the power is. Sansa's not completely dumb in this situation. She knows that she needs to gain Joffrey to her side. Not exactly Cersei, Joffrey. And that's key. Think about what the crowd and Littlefinger are going to do as well, right? Littlefinger tries to manipulate Joffrey to kill Ned, not Cersei. And so you see that here, where Sansa's playing a decent job of the game, right? She has reasonable arguments and even realizes the true power that Joffrey has. And it seems to have some effect on her, right? But the chapter ends with the terms of the deal for Ned's mercy to be set. He's going to have to confess to all of these things, and if he does so, he will live. That gets us into, I think, Sansa's best chapter of the book. So again, I have the best Sansa chapter of the book being 35. What does that tell you? I think Sansa's kind of a mid POV of this book, right? All of her, chapters are kind of in the middle section of the ranking. She doesn't have any that really go shoot to the top, but I do think she's pretty solid in this. I just think overshadowed by some of the other better POVs. But it's our final POV in King's Landing. And again, all these, both these Sansa chapters I have rated as a 9.4, but I think it's probably the ending that is probably the weakest outside of Bran for me. But yes, we do get to see her kind of understanding where her place is now, right? She's a captive in King's Landing. Joffrey is a monster. He's horrible. She can't be lashing out, right? She learns that in this chapter. She can't lash out at Joffrey. She has to do what she's told. Play the lady that she has been brought up to be. She has to do that, or else she's going to get punished, hurt. She may even get killed if she lashes out. And the chapter is handled well in terms of Sansa's grief and her anger towards Joffrey. But in terms of the plot, not much really happens. And especially in terms of a last chapter for a character, having not really anything happening is kind of a weird way to go off. Like, the only thing that really happens is, Sansa goes to court. She sees, like, Joffrey doing some awful actions to people. And then, boom, it's Joffrey showing her Ned's head and all this stuff. And it's Sansa thinking she may, kill Joffrey, but the Hound stopping her, and she realizes what her place is. So it's a good endpoint for Sansa, I guess, but it just feels like there's something lacking from it in comparison to where most of the POVs end, right? So that gets me to number 34, Catelyn 5, A Game of Thrones, a 9.4 out of 10. This chapter is definitely the climax, I think, of the middle of the book, right alongside of, like, Viserys' death, because it's, Catelyn's story up to this point has kind of been a battle of emotion and logic. Right, whether it's, her stuff with going to King's Landing, whether it's in Catelyn 3, where it's kind of her trying to, get past her depression for Bran falling, starting to act and become more of the character she needs to be. This is kind of where all of that kind of comes to a head with, Catelyn and Roderick on their way to the Crossroad Inn. And we see a culmination of Catelyn's recklessness and her battle for emotion and logic at conflict, as she runs into Tyrion. And she knows right now that she's gotten this information that Tyrion is the person who owns the dagger that was, attempted to kill Bran. And so her emotion takes over. It's the foreshadowing of what we're going to see over and over and over again. And it's this moment where you're sitting here and going, Tyrion's getting captured. And you're like, whoa. I don't think Tyrion probably did any of those things that Catelyn's accusing him of. But it's the moment that sparks the war to come. And we see some also great world and character building for the Riverlands in Catelyn's youth, as she talks about the Crossroad Inn when she was younger. She talks about some of the houses in the area. It's just a really good chapter, I think, for Catelyn in the middle of her arc that really forwards the plot for every single plot line. Number 33 is Ned 2, A Game of Thrones. So 9.4 out of 10 once again. I think this chapter is really good. It builds up Robert and Ned's characters and, what their relation is to the others. It kickstarts the real politics of book 1, whether this is, Jaime Lannister becoming Warden of the East. But also this chapter focuses a lot on the impact of Dany too, of Drogo and Dany marrying. There's a lot of interesting stuff here because this is kind of one of the first kind of moments we learn about the Robert's Rebellion stuff and the sack of King's Landing. And I think all that's great to filling out the world and the characters of Ned and Robert. I think the only thing that really holds it down is there isn't a whole bunch of impact or moment that is huge. Like, there's not a lot of, like, importance to this chapter outside of just building the world and the characters. So that would probably be my only little maybe stain on it. But yes, at number 32, I have Dany 1, which I gave a 9.5 out of 10. This is my second highest rated chapter in terms of the first chapter for a POV of a book. And I thought this was fantastic. I thought, this was the chapter that shocked me a lot. It was the chapter that opened my eyes that I think Daenerys was probably my favorite POV to read. I already knew Ned was great, right? I knew Ned was awesome, but this reread, I really enjoyed reading Daenerys this time in this reread, and this is why. I think, you have a great lore and an establishing chapter for Daenerys and Viserys about House Targaryen, what they are, who they are, their dynamic, and what's going to be between them for the first 5 chapters for Daenerys. and as well as establishing what happened in Robert's Rebellion and the buildup of Dany meeting Drogo, right? It shows us this character in Daenerys who's very shy. She's still, learning who she is. She's still very young, but we're also seeing, a flip side of what happened from like Ned and Robert, right? When they talk in the crypts in Ned 1, we know, right, their side of Robert's Rebellion, right? And even Ned 2, it goes even into more detail about Robert's Rebellion. We get a flip side of that, right? We see it from the Targaryen side of things, right? Daenerys as this girl who's done nothing wrong, but now she's on the run and all these things. She's being forced to marry Drogo, this kind of barbarian chieftain type of guy. It's a really, really awesome opening chapter for Daenerys and makes her by far one of the most interesting right off the bat. She is not like most POVs in this book where they kind of start a little slow and as they get going, they just pick up more and more steam. Daenerys, to me, is a POV that starts strong and ends strong. And I think her lowest parts are like around kind of after Viserys' death. Not many POVs are kind of like that. Number 31 picks up right where we left off with Dany 8. I have, again, 9.5 out of 10, but we see the fallout of Drogo's injury as he falls from his horse. I love this chapter for its handling of grief and loss. I think Daenerys' emotions are quite understandable. The way she's processing losing all of her power, losing everything, her security, her home, everything is tied to Drogo. Her as a Khaleesi, she cannot, command the Dothraki, and it's her dealing with that stuff. It's her going to the extremes to try and get Drogo back, to not have him die. She goes to extreme measures. We see how this desperation and the grief leads to blood magic and changes the entire story. It has significance, great writing. I think you could possibly put this chapter higher. I just felt like this was a good spot for it. But it's one of those things where we see the repercussions in the next chapter and we see why all this stuff had to happen. But I love the way George plays with this idea of Daenerys and her, it seems like she gains all this stuff and then immediately loses it. I think it's a great chapter for me. I think it's definitely one of my favorites of the book, even though I don't think it's one of maybe the best, like the top 10. Number 30 is Bran 5. I gave it a 9.6 out of 10. I think this is probably the best Bran chapter of the book in terms of at least the first half. Bran is almost a nothing character in terms of viewing events, not an active POV, outside of Bran 4 and Bran 5 and going forward. And this really kind of starts to flop in Bran 4 and 5 because Bran in 5, he's actually a active POV. It feels like we're doing stuff with the character. And my favorite part of this chapter is, once again, Bran and Robb's relationship as the two continue growing close and worrying about the future as war seems to be brewing. All of that stuff that's going to be important going forward is kind of built up here. We see Robb taking on more and more responsibility and how he handles Ned being attacked, right? Because Theon is pushing Robb to, you should call your banners and, they should start waging war because of the attack done on Ned, and that's his responsibility to do. And also Catelyn taking Tyrion. So it seems the war is brewing and Robb's going to have to get involved at some point. And so you have all of that great dynamic going on there as well, but we also get the wildling attack on Bran. It's an action-packed kind of moment where, we don't get a lot of action in this first book, but when we do, it's usually written pretty well. And so you're kind of on the edge of your seat. What's going to happen with Bran and Robb? As Bran is being held as kind of a hostage, he feels helpless, something that's really going to motivate Bran in the coming chapter, something he's going to deeply think about. But it shows us the viciousness of the wolves that Robb and Grey Worm will do more of in the future. And a very interesting ending with Theon coming in with a controversial action, a shot with an arrow that could have possibly have killed Bran because, the deserter does have his like knife dagger like at Bran's throat. If that arrow had not like instantly killed the man, it could have easily have gotten Bran killed. And so this character is also another really good building block for Theon's personality. And there's a bit of foreshadowing here as to Theon's future decisions because he gets scolded by this. Robb is pissed off. So, yeah. And that gets us into the 20s now as we're going to start really hitting some of the best chapters of the book. And that gets us into number 29. I have Arya 3 rated as a 9.7 out of 10. Again, Arya 3, I think, is a really good chapter. It focuses on her learning from Syrio. We have a lot of different foreshadowing to how Arya will survive in the next few books, and more foreshadowing to her Faceless Men training. And this is the chapter where she ends up running away from Tommen and Myrcella, and ends up into the secret passages where she spies Varys and Illyrio. And a lot of their conversation is still relevant even now when we think about Illyrio and his motivations into young Griff and the planning between the two and the connection. It's actually a really important chapter even when you go back on it. So again, I really love the stuff we get with Varys and Illyrio in this chapter. I love what we see with, Arya progressing in her journey with, becoming maybe a Faceless Man in the future, and also just kind of what Arya will have to do to even a more of an extent as she escapes from the Red Keep in her next chapter. Number 28, I have Tyrion 7. I really like Tyrion 7. It's an introduction into Tywin Lannister. It's the first time we actually see him. And yes, we have, heard about him, and we know more or less somewhat what we should kind of think about the character before we meet him, but it's the first time we really see what this guy is about. But we see the carnage that has been afflicted upon the Riverlands, and the consequences of Catelyn's actions, like the owner of the Crossroad Inns being killed, as Tywin makes it a base of operations. So this is kind of the first chapter where we see, Tyrion back with the Lannisters after leaving the Vale, all that stuff going down. And we get a good look into the relationship between Tyrion and Tywin. Already that was kind of foreshadowed in the last chapter with Tyrion, with, the Tysha story, but we get it even more here, right? Because as Tyrion is kind of made to fight with the mountain clans, but we also see that Tywin is falling for the bait and preparing for battle with Robb. It's a great leading chapter to where we're going to go with in the story later on with Tyrion in terms of the Battle of the Green Fork. It's a nice prelude. It's really just a great build-up chapter for a lot of different things, right? Tyrion becoming Hand in this book, the Battle of the Green Fork. Great building chapter, which is kind of why it's maybe down here at 28 and not a little bit higher, as I think a lot of the interactions between Tyrion and Tywin will actually get better as the book goes on, but it's still a really good building block chapter for Tyrion. Number 27, I have Catelyn 2, and this is my first 10 out of 10. I think the rest of the chapters from here on out are all really good chapters. I gave them all 10s. Maybe that's generous because when I started this ranking, maybe I, was a little bit lenient on where I rated things, but I think they're, a quarter of the chapters in this book there's not a lot of flaws in them. And so I gave a lot of 10s for this book. But Catelyn 2 I find so interesting because it's really a chapter where it forces Ned into becoming Hand of the King. Because Ned himself is very against going south. And what is very different in terms of the book to the show of this adaptation is that the show actually has Catelyn wanting Ned to not go south. And so when you see like the image where Ned is looking towards the camera and you have Catelyn and Luwin behind him, it's supposed to represent in the show anyway, both sides tugging at what Ned should do. That's not how it is in the book at all. And it reads so differently to me. I think this is one of those really nefarious chapters. If you want to look at like Ned being this, or if you want to look at Catelyn being this kind of manipulative or villainous type character. And for me, I see why Catelyn does it. But Catelyn 2, very interesting because it's what pushes Ned to go south. Again, it focuses on this idea of Ned becoming the Hand. It focuses on how Catelyn and Luwin are manipulating Ned to go south. But not only that, there's also this underlying like mystery going on of what happened to Jon Arryn. Lysa sends Catelyn this message that it seems like Jon was killed by the Lannisters. But also, it seems that, Catelyn is trying to push for Jon to be made to leave. Because Ned is kind of backed into a weird position. He can't take Jon to King's Landing. That would be horrible for Jon, right? He would be kind of like publicly shamed almost because of being a bastard. It'd be 10 times worse at King's Landing than it would be here at Winterfell. And, well, we know a lot of that is because of Catelyn. That's what makes Jon, it seems like, not looked upon fondly. But in King's Landing, where you have all these people that are spies and, all that stuff, Jon would not really be that welcome there. So it kind of puts Ned in a position where what does he do? Because Catelyn just refuses to have Jon even live in the castle when Ned's gone, which is wild. She's trying to force Jon into becoming basically homeless or, kicking him out of even the castle as a whole. Like, it is a really dark mindset that Catelyn's in right now. And think about it like this, right? Bran hasn't even been pushed from the window yet. Catelyn is not at this deep emotional like conflict. Like, yes, the letter, but it's not like the Catelyn in Catelyn 3 where she's completely broken as a character after Bran's fall. This is Catelyn almost scheming to get Jon to go to the wall. Because think about it, right? She gets information from Benjen, or Luwin does anyway, that Jon wants to go to the wall. And this is basically made, well, Jon is really drunk. He's stumbling to even walk in that first chapter. It's a really interesting chapter. Really like this chapter. I think Catelyn 2 is a little bit slept on, but it is one I really do enjoy. That gets us to number 26, Ned 3. So again, I think Ned 3, it gets the best parts and the conclusion of Sansa 1, where you have everything of the Trident kind of coming to the front. So what this chapter does really well is it paints the conflict of the Lannisters and the Starks, right? It's almost a mini skirmish in the Game of Thrones that's being played, right? The battle for really Robert, right? Having that power of who has Robert's, backing, more or less. And we do know that it's Ned, but it also shows that Cersei has sway because it focuses on the aftermath of Nymeria and Arya being attacked by Joffrey. And I love how it sets up the main conflict. Because if you even think about what's going on, right? The tales being spun. In truth, we know that Arya was being attacked by Joffrey, but what do the Lannisters say to Robert, right? They say that Joffrey was attacked by Arya and Nymeria, the opposite of what happened. Think about what's going to end up happening with Ned, right? Ned was trying to, basically form a coup, and that's because Joffrey was not the legit heir. The Lannisters were lying about that. So, a lot of parallels there, but you also see how Ned thinks through these situations. Ned is a military mind. He's thinking about the people present in this meeting. It seems like there could be a conflict. This could be the end. It's very likely Ned could have gone north after this if things had gone even worse than they do. And so when you get, Lady's death in this, you get the Butcher's boy's death because the Hound kills him, really painting the stakes of what's happening. It's one of those chapters that really starts to get the ball rolling. It's one of those big, big moments because when you also then think about this, right? Where Bran, we know, has been pushed out of the window by Jaime and Cersei. There's a lot there, right? The Lannisters are very much being painted as the bad guys, and it really just enhances where we're going. Number 25 is Ned 7. This chapter follows, once again, basically directly after a Sansa chapter. So it gets the fruits of what the Sansa chapters build up. And that's why, one thing I talk about a lot is the Sansa chapters feel just kind of mid. They're just okay in a lot of ways, usually. But Ned usually comes right after Sansa and gets some of the best parts of that. So we see after the dinner and the feast after the first day of the tournament, that's when we come into Ned. And this Ned chapter is really long. This is the only chapter that I took 2 parts on doing. Now, part of that was because I was in the middle of doing school stuff, so it was really hard to do a longer chapter in 1 week. But this ended up being, I think, the longest video of the series, but I think it was an hour and a half long. But it's a really big one, right? You had the first half, which is about convincing Robert to not fight in the melee, and there's a lot of psychology going on there, right? Was Cersei wanting him to actually do this so that he would maybe be killed? And that's what Varys suggests later on in the chapter. Was that maybe happening? Maybe. But then you also have stuff about Barristan and Ned discussing Sir Hugh's death that Sansa witnessed in her last chapter. There's a lot of stuff that's mysterious, so we don't know really what's going on completely. And so that's even more questionable when you think about the tournament and all these things that seem to be getting manipulated, because Sir Hugh could have possibly had a lot of information. And so we get, the jousting tournaments finish, which is also awesome, which we're seeing, the Hound and Gregor, clash for a little while. It's a little skirmish, it's not anything crazy, but it shows what we could maybe see in the future. It's an awesome moment. But we also see the Hound being named the champion for saving Loras, that little entire section of it. And then we also see the chapter ending with Ned and Varys discussing the fate of Robert. It's a great chapter where we just get a ton of it, right? You get so much in this Ned chapter that forwards the plot, forwards the mystery going on right now. It has an awesome moment with Varys. You have an awesome moment with Robert. You get just so much. It just has a lot in the chapter. It's very rich with information. And so to me, I think a really good chapter definitely deserves to kind of be in the top third. Number 24, I have Arya 4. So I really like this chapter because in Ned's last chapter, right, we are so kind of worried about his plot, because it's right after Ned's coup, that you almost kind of forget about the other characters that are also at King's Landing, right? You almost forget about Arya. You almost forget about Sansa. And so I think George does this perfectly. You go right into Arya directly after Ned's been taken captive, and you're like, whoa, wait a second. Yeah, Arya's doing this whole plot with Syrio right now. This is really everything that's gone on with Arya throughout this entire book. It's her kind of doing an Assassin's Creed type mission where it's, her trying to sneak out of the Red Keep, but having this last little moment with Syrio Forel, which is really, a powerful and fantastic end to their dynamic. And, the way Syrio's taking down these guards sounds awesome. It's what Arya wants to be at some point of her life. But we see her have to, we have to see her be very smart in the way she thinks about doing things, how she has to keep composed as she walks by all these guards, maybe, sit on top of walls or right next to her. If anyone was to, see her, she'd be captured. Not trusting, for instance, the City Watch, who also have flipped on her. She doesn't know that, but she kind of rationalizes, it might not be so good to alert them if they're also not helping your side, right? Because she sees her house is basically being slaughtered. Everyone here is being killed. And even in this chapter, we see her killing her first person as she kills the stable boy who was trying to turn her into Cersei. This chapter really feels like the true conclusion of Arya in this book. The last chapter is in a lot of ways the conclusion of Ned and his story, as it also is of Arya. So this is kind of, in my opinion, almost the climax of Arya's actual personal journey, whereas the next part is kind of like that falling action for Arya. So really great chapter. It does a ton for future development for Arya, but also moves her plot along quite nicely. And for me, that's why it's kind of up here. I think it's not her best chapter. Of course, her best chapter is going to be, her last one with at Baelor, and we'll talk about that when we get closer to the top, but definitely a good Arya chapter. Number 23 I have is Catelyn 7, Game of Thrones. Once again, I love this chapter because it's trial by combat with Bronn and Vardis. It's really the first time we get like an in-depth fighting sequence. Yes, we had the battle coming up, the Eyrie and getting to the Eyrie, but this is like one of those where it's like a miniature version of what we're going to eventually see with the Mountain and Oberyn, right? Where it's Bronn outsmarting Vardis, where Vardis might be a very competent sword fighter, of course, but it's Bronn thinking outside of the box, being that sellsword. It's been foreshadowed already with Catelyn, in the past, where she's talking about how the sword seems to be part of an arm, or part of Bronn's arm, and he moves like a panther, strong but also fast. And so that really comes to fruition here, but also it's a really impactful moment, because we know right here, if Bronn loses, well, that's not good. That means Tyrion's going to die. And so it has a lot of that tension there, which for a first read is definitely going to be present there. On a second read, not as much. And I will say, for George to have killed Tyrion here wouldn't have made a lot of sense given all the character work you've done for the character. And this was only about probably 2/3 into the book. It didn't really make sense to kill him here. It still has a lot of entertaining things going on, but we also know that there's a massive reveal that happens in this book that paints us to kind of question some of the things going on about what Lysa has been saying, right? Because we learn here that Robin was not actually going to be sent to be fostered with Tywin, like what Lysa was saying. He was going to be fostered with Stannis Baratheon, because that's what the Maester tells Catelyn. That is a huge revelation, because that means that Lysa was lying about some of the things she talks about and why she fled. Again, it's something Catelyn should be questioning and thinking about, but she just doesn't really put it all together. And I can't blame her either. How would she possibly know that Lysa killed Jon? But it should be one of those things where it's like in the back of your mind, that is a weird thing going on. And so again, there's a lot that's really entertaining to read. It's a fun chapter to read, and it has massive parallels to Tyrion's second trial, because in a lot of ways, the fights kind of play out the same. You have one person that's more heavily armored, that's like more traditional of a brutish type fighter, right? And on the other side, you have someone that's a little bit more maybe smaller, quicker, using, their speed to try and win. It's very similar in a lot of ways. It's just, this is like the miniature version. It's, okay, take the two fighters of Vardis and Bronn and upgrade them. Oberyn and the Mountain. A lot of great parallels. It was a great chapter to read, and so I think 23 is a good spot for it. Number 22, I really do like Ned 10 as well. I think there's just every one of these chapters I can just rave about, especially in this top 25, but this chapter is great because it starts really with the dream of the Tower of Joy. And this has a lot of implications on the story. Because, okay, because Ned is one of the only people left in the world that have any semblance of knowledge of the Tower of Joy. So when we have, anything about speculating about what happened at the Tower of Joy, who Jon's parents are, regardless of whatever theory you believe, really, there's a lot that can be drawn from here, right? And so going through these moments, that's like the first half of the vision that we kind of see with Bran, say, in season 6, right? A lot of that is kind of present in this dream. It has a lot there that is beautiful to kickstart this chapter, as this is the fallout kind of after Jaime's attacked. But it's great on that part of it, right? Alone. Because we start out the sequence of the Tower of Joy. But then you also have more in this where, Ned's thinking about Lyanna. He's thinking about maybe some things that imply maybe Jon's parentage one way or another. But even then you get like Robert and Cersei's relationship, which kind of comes to the front. It's not something we get a lot in the book, right? The TV show, I think, did a really good job in season 1 of kind of expanding Robert and Cersei's relationship. But we get it right here, which is amazing. I really love the dynamic between Robert, Ned, and Cersei in this room after Ned's attack, because you can tell that Robert and Cersei have this strained relationship. And even though Robert and Ned have quarreled about how Daenerys should be handled, Robert still cares for Ned like a brother. And so that's that huge point where if you're looking at the book right now, Ned is getting closer to figuring out what's going on with Cersei. This is a big moment because you realize, okay, Robert is actually going to take Ned's word over Cersei's word. That's key to the story. If Robert doesn't die in the boar hunt, not looking good for the Lannisters. It's a big chapter. There's a lot of implications on things that could come forward. But we get Ned becoming Hand of the King once again, and Robert is going on a hunt, right? Everything's sparking up, and that's what Robert does. He kind of hides from the conflict of politics and all the stuff going on. It's basically defines his rulership. He wasn't really a hands-on king, more or less. He kind of let others do things in the background, and that ends up screwing up the realm. But I do like it. But one of the reasons I kind of put it down a little bit is it is a shorter chapter, very similar to like maybe the opening chapters of the book. But I do think every chapter, or I think with this chapter, every page has a meaning. Every page is strongly written and feels like a neatly almost written little story in and of itself on the backstories of a lot of the characters. Number 21 is Dany 4, which again, this is kind of like the real culmination of Daenerys' early book arc. We see her and Viserys' relationship really come to a head. Now, this isn't the chapter that Viserys dies in necessarily, but it's almost like the chapter in which Daenerys and Viserys' relationship completely breaks down, right? Daenerys has tried to help Viserys with all these things, trying to give him, trying to integrate him more into the Dothraki culture so that he's not as viewed as so bad, trying to do all these things, right? And Viserys just keeps pushing away and pushing away. And Daenerys is trying to forgive Viserys for the actions, that happened in the grass, but now Viserys, threatens to kill her and her baby. And has not even thanked Daenerys for, his gifts, as Daenerys had invited him to like a dinner, more or less, giving him, some Dothraki clothing so that he might not be as hot or things like that, having really thoughtful actions. What we eventually see is Daenerys fully stands up for herself now. It's kind of over. That part of her that maybe would have allowed Viserys to abuse her is over. Daenerys hitting him full in the face when he starts getting angry and trying to assault her. And she puts him in his place. It's a strong moment for the character of Daenerys, because even in Dany 3, yes, she stands up to Viserys, but it's not her, in the power. It's not her doing the action against Viserys. It's her cause. So this chapter is that breaking and that fracturing of that relationship where Dany's not going to protect him anymore. If he goes out of line, you can't look to Daenerys. You've broken that. Another thing I do like about this chapter is I like the lore we get of the Dothraki, as this is them kind of coming to Vaes Dothrak, and they're going to be there for, a couple chapters. I do like that. I do like that we get a bit of that lore there of Vaes Dothrak. But this is really the chapter where we start to see Daenerys become, the true dragon, right? And going away from her brother Viserys. Number 20 I have is Tyrion 9. Again, I think this chapter is a pretty good conclusion for Tyrion. It's, right after the Battle of the Green Fork. And this chapter focuses on a war council with Tywin's bannermen, talking about the different ways, talking about how, the Battle of the Whispering Wood and the Battle of the Camps is a crushing defeat for the Lannisters. Jaime's imprisoned. Everybody's going about their own different ways. Some are even suggesting that they should sue for peace with the Starks. It just completely breaks down. All that's fascinating, of course, right? But the most fascinating part about this chapter is when you have Tyrion and Tywin with Kevan, right? And you see that dynamic where Tywin is still manipulating Tyrion, right? But it's going even further than that. Because now, because Tywin views Jaime as basically being dead to him, right? There's no way they're going to get him back at this point, is what they believe. Tywin starts to treat Tyrion like a person because Tywin needs him. Tyrion is just a tool to Tywin. And so that really comes out here. And given this is the last time we're going to see them, until after the Battle of the Blackwater, it's very interesting because Tyrion, you would feel like if you put this conversation into context of when the next time Tyrion was going to see Tywin, you would have thought that Tywin would have been much more nicer to Tyrion, given, his job and the way he does things he does at King's Landing. That isn't the case. And so I really like that Tyrion goes from, the very beginning of the book, not really feeling like he has a place in his family, being looked down upon, being kind of viewed as useless, to, by the end of the book, being Hand of the King, given power over even his own sister, being viewed as, in Tywin's eyes, probably the most valuable Lannister in terms of, his children. It's an interesting arc that Tyrion goes on, and setting him up for what he will have to do later on as Hand of the King. Number 19 I have as Catelyn 3. I really do like this chapter as well for Catelyn, because Catelyn in this chapter is a really long chapter as well, but she goes on like her own arc, right? She starts out the chapter feeling, very sad, and she's not able to sleep well. She's not leaving Bran. She's completely broken as a person, right? And, this is after Bran's fall, right? Ned's left, and she's, having to do all these things, and the one that should be responsible for governing Winterfell at this time, because Robb's still very young. But it's, Catelyn not being able to do that stuff. And so Robb then steps up. It's Robb starting to grow up and growing into that role, eventually of becoming king in the North. And he takes control of Winterfell. And so that mini arc for Catelyn is really strong. Because, she starts out, like I said, being kind of sad. And she wakes up. This assassination attempt happens. And all of that is extremely traumatic. It's this really big moment for Catelyn. And she barely survives the attack, but we don't even end the chapter there. We also continue afterwards, right after she's kind of healed and she's slept for like a few days at that point. There's like a break in between, the assassination attempt and going forward. But then she also, realizes, okay, what she has to do, right? Someone has just tried to kill her child. That gives her focus. She starts to realize, okay, this had to have been, maybe the Lannisters, right? They need to investigate this dagger, get some more proof about it. And so that prompts her to go to King's Landing with Roderick. And so you have a whole character arc within one chapter with Catelyn. And not only is it, a huge plot, chapter, right, in terms of forwarding the plot, it's huge for character development for Robb and Catelyn in this chapter. Beautiful. It's also kind of the last moment we're ever going to see Catelyn with Bran or Rickon. So when you think about that, also kind of hits quite hard as well. So yeah, I think a really good chapter from Catelyn, especially, this early on in the book, right? Catelyn 3 is quite early on in the story. For it to be in my top 20, it definitely tells you it's one of the better chapters of the book. Number 18 I have is Catelyn 10. Again, Catelyn 10 is basically the Battle of the Whispering Wood. Really the thing with Battle of the Whispering Wood that's different, for instance, is we just saw the Battle of the Green Fork, right? It's right before this one. And so you get very hands-on, in-depth of the battle, right? We're with Tyrion as he's fighting through the Battle of the Green Fork. This one's the opposite. So George gives us kind of almost three perspectives into a battle, right? So with Daenerys, we see her kind of coming in after the battle, looking at the carnage of what has occurred. In Tyrion, we get directly in the battle. And so with Catelyn, we get that other third perspective. We get it where you're not in the battle necessarily, but you're hearing it. You're seeing glimpses of the battle that's going on. And so you kind of go through this chapter where it's discussing what the plan is and everything going into the Battle of the Whispering Wood, but it's Catelyn, like us, the reader, listening to everything going on, the stress and the pain that Catelyn's going through. Robb could easily die in this battle, right? They have less men than the Lannisters do by a lot. And so, hearing, people dying in the background, seeing a glimpse of Robb and seeing how much Robb has grown, right? He's going into a battle. He's leading an army. Only a couple of chapters, a couple 100 pages ago, he was crying in Bran's arms. Tells you a lot of the growth for not only Catelyn, but also Robb. And so when Robb comes back victorious and you have Jaime, it completely shifts the entire story. Because exactly what Robb needed to happen has happened. He's taken a Lannister captive that he could then use to get Ned and the girls back. He's delivered a massive blow to the Lannisters where they are viewed as actually a threat now. And so you have all of that where it's a great buildup of just tension exploding, right? This is kind of the battle that's been built up for at least 3 or 4 Catelyn chapters now this time. And it also plants some of the seeds of the issues going forward with the Karstark sons being killed in the battle as Jaime tried to get to Robb. So many plot lines are just going to come from that moment alone. It shows that George was planning in ahead of things he could do. And so I love the way that George paints the battle going on from Catelyn's POV and the feelings that she feels. And that's what puts it up here in the top 20. I know you guys may put this battle a little further up, but to me, I think it was a solid chapter, but not my top 10 for me personally. Number 17 is actually Ned 1. This is my highest rated chapter where it's just an opening to a chapter. And it's crazy to me that, Ned has such an influence that even his first chapter is in the top almost 15. It's number 17. But this chapter establishes just so much in so few pages. It's only 10 pages long, right? Which I'd say is probably around the average for this book. It's probably around 10, 12 pages. But we learn so much about it, right? We learn the history of Robert's rebellion from the rebels' side. We learn who Robert is and his dynamic with Ned. It's a huge foreshadowing, chapter into Jon's parentage and even Ned's fate as they're in the crypts. And there's a lot of signs here that Ned may die in the future and all this stuff. The chapter is just fantastic, and it's a staple to the series. This is the chapter that I think if you were someone that was reading this before the show came out, that wasn't me, right? I had watched the first 4 seasons before I had started, reading the book. This is the chapter that I think would have caught your attention, right? Because there's so much lore, there's so much attention to detail and characters that, it's a lot, but it doesn't feel like a lot. It feels natural, the amount of information that's coming in. And I think of all of the beginning of the characters' POVs, Ned's, I think, was definitely the strongest, and I think it's definitely a staple of the first book. Number 16, this is my highest rated chapter for Bran. I think to me, Bran 6, let me just say the chapter before I get babbling on about it, but I really like this one because it's all about Robb mobilizing the North. It's showing the growth of not only Bran, but also Robb. It's Robb's last chapter with Bran. It's a really foreboding chapter, right? It reads really, really, dark because, we get it. We like that Robb is, coming into his own. He's establishing the North to go free Ned. But at the same time, Bran kind of feels like this is wrong because Osha's telling him that he should, be sending his army north of the wall based upon, the wildlings, but also the threat of the others. And so this whole thing seems doomed from the start. It's put a lot of emphasis on it, right? Because the old gods can't help Robb in the south. Everything points to this idea that it's not a good thing that Robb is going south. And it's even more heartbreaking when you think about Robb and Bran's relationship that has grown throughout this book. And for this to be Robb and Bran's last, moments together. We see more of Robb becoming Robb the Lord. Whereas maybe, early on, right, with Robb and Bran, there was a lot more of, Robb the brother. Now it's becoming less of Robb the brother. It's becoming more Robb the Lord, more of this face he has to show because, we get some of these great moments, right? where, you have Robb and the Great John and how he has to, deal with him and all this other stuff, with Roose Bolton, all these other characters that are, there. And the Karstark showing up last. But we also see some good development between Bran as well, right? As Bran gets these, really bad looks, Bran is learning how to, not let those get to him, right? To kind of, accept the position that he's in and to make the best of it. And so a lot of it is personal growth for Bran. It's personal growth for Robb, but also having some awesome moments within it as well and foreshadowing issues to follow. So I think this is by far the best Bran chapter of the book in terms of giving us interesting depth to the character of Bran and also other characters involved in the actual chapter, while also moving the plot forward quite a lot. Number 15, I have Catelyn 8. It's very similar in terms of themes of Bran 6, the one we just talked about, because it's Catelyn reuniting with Robb, so it's Catelyn viewing Robb's growth, very similar to Bran, and even getting more into him, right? It's Catelyn kind of measuring what her son has become, because, when she left Winterfell, Robb was not the character that he is now, right? And so it's Catelyn evaluating this almost new person that she's meeting, as Robb has taken all of his forces and they're now sitting at Moat Cailin. But at this time, like, what is Robb going to do? And Robb is still very indecisive. He doesn't know what he should do. He has all these different counselors telling him all the things that he should be doing, but Robb himself is a little bit unsure. And so it's Catelyn setting Robb up to be the king in the North, really, saying that he has to know what they have to do. Because at this point, right, you have a couple options. You can flee back to Winterfell. You can march, but where are you going to march? You're going to march to Tywin, or are you going to march to Jaime? What are you going to do? And so it's Catelyn having to prepare Robb and trying to really mold him into being a good lord and king in the future. And it's really great because it really brings up the stakes. The stakes that Bran couldn't really bring fully to Robb's plotline, Catelyn tells him how it is. Right? If they fail this, not only is Ned going to die, but Sansa, Arya, they're going to die. Robb now has the entire fate of House Stark pretty much on his shoulders. Like, if he can't free Ned, no one will be able to. It sets up the heights for the next few Tyrion and Catelyn chapters. It's a setup chapter, but also it's kind of like a big defining moment for both of the characters of Catelyn and Robb. It's in reality, it's Bran 6 with Catelyn, who's a more established POV, in my opinion, a better POV, with also that big growth of Robb that we enjoyed to see. Number 14, I have Jon 9, and this is the conclusion of Jon's arc. It's a fantastic chapter. I don't think it's Jon's best chapter of the book by any means, but it's definitely up there. It's following after Maester Aemon, kind of giving him this dilemma, like, what should he do? Should he, go help his family? Should he stay at the Watch, right? And so Jon is going through all this in his mind, and it's this, journey south. And us, the audience, are on the edge of our seat with Jon, because if he deserts, okay, he's a criminal. Like, he will be killed. Or would Robb save him, right? We are in Jon's head as well, like, asking the same questions he's asking. If he does get to Robb in time, will Robb pardon him? And so his whole journey going south, really big tension building. It feels like this big moment is coming. It feels like everything that Jon has been struggling with in this entire book, especially the second half, coming to a head. Who is Jon? Is he going to be a deserter or a man of the Night's Watch? And so eventually his friends, catch up to him. Again, that pays off from earlier in the story with Jon, where, he's making these friends with these people that at one point he maybe didn't like as much. It's them coming to save him now, helping him out, right? And eventually, being taken back. And then he's given the big dilemma by, Mormont. What are you going to do? I think this is a great way to finish Jon's arc. I think it's pretty flawless in terms of the execution of Jon's arc. I think there are better chapters in Jon's actual, book for this book specifically, but I definitely think a really strong finish for Jon in A Game of Thrones. Number 13, I have Dany 9. I think for me personally, this is kind of the real conclusion of the Dothraki arc of the book. And yes, Dany has one more chapter after this, Dany 10. But this is really the conclusion of the Dothraki stuff, right? The next chapter is really going to be Dany's actual conclusion to the arc. But I really like this chapter because it focuses on, what actually happened after Daenerys, went into that tent at the end of the last Daenerys chapter, Dany 8. And it's Dany, also having these dreams before she wakes up about awakening the dragons. I think some of the writing in terms of, waking the dragon, because it's a callback to her brother and the influence her brother had on her, but it slowly changes the sentence, right? From don't wake the dragon to like wake the dragon, right? It's a great way of kind of giving foreshadowing to Daenerys to give her the strength and the ability to go, yeah, I need to do this. That's what my dream told me. It has great repercussions. If you think about other Targaryens in the past, were they haunted by these same dreams? And if Daenerys' dreams actually did work, why didn't someone else's dreams? It makes you question characters like Aegon the Fifth. And so I really love that dilemma. Because was the Mad King having dreams like this? Was that maybe some of the reasons, outside of other stuff that was going on, helped to maybe why he went mad? It's a lot of stuff that I find very fascinating with Daenerys. But also then you have Daenerys, in the Miri conflict as well. Daenerys figuring out her child died. Her husband is basically not even alive anymore. He's alive, but he's just a zombie. He follows commands. That's about it. And then you get one of the best speeches of the book, right there along with say Aemon's speech in this book, where, it's what is life? Miri talking about all the things that she went through and her village went through and kind of relaying that to Drogo. Right? And I love that because it paints Miri in this idea where it's can you call her a villain? Is she just a person in this world that did good things, did bad things, and she's just a gray character? You understand Miri so well, and that's why I love Daenerys' arc, because Daenerys has some of the most fascinating, anti-hero or villain characters in the first book. Miri, Viserys are two of the best written characters in this book. I just love the way that arc kind of concludes because, it's her realizing the Dothraki have kind of abandoned her, all this stuff. Again, really well done. Not the best chapter for Daenerys in the book, but definitely a strong one. Number 12, I have Tyrion 8. What can I say? This battle is fantastic, right? It's the Battle of the Green Fork, going through this dynamic of the tension and building up to the Battle of the Green Fork with Tyrion and Tywin, and he knows he's going to be, in the vanguard. But we also see, a buildup of what Tyrion's relationship is going to look like with Shae leading forward, because Tyrion has this weird relationship with Shae where he doesn't want just a whore. He wants her to be his girlfriend as well. It's a really weird relationship, and it goes to kind of the trauma that Tyrion has gone through in the past, believing that he cannot really be loved. And so it really hits a lot of Tyrion's themes really well in the chapter, and also hits some of the stuff with Tywin and Tyrion really well, while also then having a very interesting battle sequence with the Battle of the Green Fork. I really do enjoy this chapter because it's the Lannister POV, and you also have the Catelyn POV of the war going on. I just love it because it paints the anti-war theme to a new high, right? Seeing the carnage and the horrible things going on in warfare as Tyrion goes through it, and maybe he's going to die in this battle, but he doesn't end up dying. Again, I think a great chapter from Tyrion. I would say probably his best of the book. Number 11, I have Jon 7. We finally get to, I think, the meat of Jon's arc. I really think this is where Jon's arc goes from being, good. I think, after the first 3 Jon chapters, he starts to become more of a pretty good POV. But I think this is where he gets kind of focused into being a great POV in the book. And that's why I think Jon's rated a little bit lower in terms of the POVs for me, because he's very inconsistent in terms of how well the character is written, or I would say the heights of the character in the first book. We see how he handles Ned's imprisonment. We see the arc of the others, coming back, being paid off, right? It's 2 of Jon's, biggest motivations at play, right? Where, his family and wanting to protect his father and rescue his father, but also the threat of the White Walkers as we have that, attack happening in this chapter, right? Because it focuses on the bodies that we see that Ghost more or less found. But we also see, again, some foreshadowing from Jon of how Ned and Rob's story is going to go. I thought that was really interesting. And we see Jon having to defeat this White Walker attack that was trying to kill Jeor Mormont. It is beautifully paced. It's horrifying. It reads like a horror chapter as Jon seemingly can do nothing to this other until he finally is able to burn it alive and part of the tower as well. It's beautiful, right? I love the way this chapter is paced, and I love the execution as well. It's like this is really the two, I think, high moments for Jon that's been really built up pretty well throughout the first 6 Jon chapters of the book. Number 10, I have Dany 5. Again, this chapter is huge. It is the death of Viserys Targaryen. It is the end of the early part of Daenerys' arc where it's been completely focused on Daenerys and Viserys, her growing apart from him, getting out of his abuses. And it's finally where she gives up protecting him, where once again he threatens to kill her child, breaking Dothraki culture and bearing a sword and wielding it at Daenerys. But let's also not forget there's a lot of other stuff that builds up to it, right? Where Daenerys is getting all this attention because she was able to eat the horse's heart, and she's being like praised by all the Dothraki. Everyone's giving her all this attention. And that gets to Viserys, right? Viserys has never been given any of that, never any of that attention or respect or power, even though he's the last, male Targaryen that he knows of. Like he doesn't, think about Aemon, for instance, being another Targaryen alive, or maybe, a young Griff or Jon Snow type character. He believes he is the last male Targaryen, and he's never gotten any of that Daenerys gets. And so it pushes him. It takes, his insecurity and takes it to that next level, and he makes a fool of himself. And eventually he's killed. And again, I think Viserys' death is so poetic. The way it's done, it's a fantastic way for the character to end in this book specifically. And we see the end of Dany and Viserys' arc. And it also paints Daenerys in a little bit more of a harsh light. The way she kind of won't look away and watches as Viserys dies. But I love Daenerys in this book, and you guys can tell, and I definitely think it's one of her best chapters, but definitely not the best. Number 9, I have Ned 8. This is by far one of my favorite chapters in the entire series. This chapter, the entire focus on whether or not Robert should have Daenerys, Viserys, and also Daenerys' child killed. I love that, because that little idea right there alone makes you think about, if you were in Ned's shoes, what would you do, right? Or if you were in Robert's shoes. It poses this question that is so interesting to think about. Because on one hand, if you're Robert, if he does kill Daenerys and her child here, he prevents really any Targaryens from ever really trying to conquer Westeros again. You could say that he saves thousands of future lives. Now, that's with hindsight. We know that Daenerys is going to come over in the next book, or maybe A Dream of Spring. So it is hindsight. A part of it is at this moment, you don't know that Daenerys is going to do that. You don't know that Daenerys is going to come over with the Dothraki at some point. And so there is that, right? That's kind of the moral argument. But with Ned, you're sitting here going, okay, but Daenerys is an innocent child, and her baby is also innocent as well. She's done nothing wrong. You don't know that she's going to come over. And so it poses that interesting question, which leads to Robert and Ned kind of having a fight, and Ned giving up his position, planning to leave King's Landing, until Littlefinger interrupts him as, he shows him the brothel with which Jon had been visiting. I just love the chapter. I love this chapter because it puts the different ethics for both sides. It shows that one thing that always split Ned and Robert: the treatment of the Targaryen kids. And maybe this even hits more of a sore spot given who Jon's parents are. I really do enjoy, Ned 8. I think it's one of the most slept on chapters. It's beautifully written and is rich of themes and philosophy questions. Number 8, I have Ned 15. This is the last Ned chapter that we get of the story, and it's a banger. It is Ned at his lowest moment. It's where Ned is put to the test, where he has to question his ethics, his morality, and what he truly believes in. And that's all put to the test. Because this is, after Ned's, coup and all that. So he's in the black cells. He's being starved to death. He doesn't have any proper health care for his his leg. He feels like he's going insane because, again, he's not seeing any light. He doesn't know when days are passing. He, most of the time, just sleeps, or even when he's awake, it seems like he's having visions or other things. He's seeing stuff. Like, imagine how you would be if you didn't see any, like, sign of real light. You weren't really getting food or drink for, like, a week. It was just black. Like, that is an insane thing to go through. And there's a lot of foreshadowing to Jon's mother as Ned thinks about, Lyanna and the broken promise or the things about, Lyanna that he remembers. But then he is greeted by Viserys, which again gives us, until he is greeted by Varys, which again gives us pause. How does Varys have access to this? And this kind of foreshadows events to come as, Varys is under, his own disguise and things like that. There is a lot of foreshadowing to Storm of Swords when Tyrion gets broken down. And Varys more or less gives him an ultimatum. Either plead guilty and, take back his claims or die. But as well, right? Because Ned already is kind of like, I would rather keep my honor, keep my pride, keep all these things, saying the truth, than destroy my entire, reputation, than not. But then it gets put to the test. Similarly to how Jon is kind of questioning his, loyalties and his identity, Ned, a character that is, into his 30s, who already has established values, is seeing them put to the test. It's everything that King's Landing has been doing to him since the very first time he set foot there. It's questioning, what can he allow to happen? It's really the Ned and Robert chapter all over again, except the circumstances are different. Ned's in a worse situation. And on one hand, Varys is saying straight up bluntly that Sansa might get treated much worse and could even die if Ned does the wrong thing. And it's here where we see Ned kind of giving in, right? He makes his decision in the Arya chapter. But I love it. It's great reflection of everything Ned's gone through in this entire book. Here. It isn't my favorite Ned chapter of the book, but it's really a culmination of everything Ned has gone through. It's really compelling writing in something that, I don't know. I don't know if there's other writers that would be able to hit such beautiful character writing in one book. But that gets us to number 7, Jon 8. To me, I think this is Jon's best chapter of the book. And why do I say that? And I think a lot of it comes down to this is where the peak of Jon's kind of identity crisis is at, right? This is the whole thought process behind, why he ends up deserting in his last chapter. It's because he's struck between two issues, right? It's him trying to be swayed by Mormont to stay, right? To stay in the watch and to, stay here, right? He's gifted a Valyrian sword and long claw by Mormont. Thorne is sent away as, Thorne and Jon don't like each other. But again, this isn't enough to make Jon stay. It's not enough. And Mormont seems to kind of know that, right? As Aemon then talks to Jon, and he has probably the best speech of the books in general, right? Talking about the whole main theme of a Game of Thrones, of A Song of Ice and Fire as a whole, and the idea of love and duty. And giving, Aemon's actual full backstory, right? Giving the horrors that Aemon has felt. And it ties in beautifully with Daenerys as well. But Jon realizes that he's in the same situation as Aemon was, just it's now the Starks, not the Targaryens. I love the writing, the character struggles that Jon is feeling, and that study that's going on. And so that's why it's at number 7. I think it's the most powerful chapter for Jon personally, as well as the plot being forward as well. And I personally just, it's a big love of mine. And I think you guys probably will agree with this chapter. Maybe you guys might have kind of the other attack a little bit higher than this one, but I personally find this to be my favorite for Jon. Number 6, I have Ned 14. It's Ned's coups chapter. It's, again, not my favorite chapter because it really feels like this is everything that's happened now, right? The last couple of preparation chapters to this moment, it's Ned finally being caged in. It's Ned kind of being put in this trap. There's no other decisions he can make. It's nothing else that he can do, but he wants to put action. But Ned goes into action trying to put Stannis on the throne. It all goes wrong as he thinks he's confident with Littlefinger and the Gold Cloaks, but they end up betraying him and him being imprisoned. It's one of the best moments of the series, but I think the overall chapter is, I think it's one of Ned's best, of course, but I think to me, I like the actual chapter before this a bit better because it lays all of the foundations for this chapter to happen, right? And it puts more of, the character work of Ned to the test, right? As we slowly see him being unraveled, right? Having to do some, not great actions, not dutiful or honorable actions, having to bribe the Gold Cloaks. This is really just the conclusion of all those actions. And so I think it is definitely a top 10 chapter of the book. It personally is not my favorite Ned chapter, but is definitely a good one. Number 5. So entering our top 5, which I think I have a pretty good variety of, even though I do have 2 Ned chapters in it. But I think Ned 12 is slightly better than Ned 14. I think you can kind of flip these around whatever way. And like I talk about, I think any chapter within like the top 30 you could have anywhere on this list. But I really personally like Ned 12 because it's the reveal, right? The mystery is gone, right? We've been building up the whole book, whether it's through Catelyn, whether it's through Ned's POV, what Jon Arryn really died for. Now we know the Lannisters didn't actually kill Jon Arryn, but it's the reveal of the main mystery of the book, right? Ned realizes once again, coming off of the seeds that were planted in the last Sansa chapter, that, okay, Ned has figured it out. Jaime and Cersei have been sleeping together, and that Robert and Cersei's quote-unquote kids were actually theirs. It layers back everything that's been set up through the entire story. And it changes the entire King's Landing ground, right? Because right now, Ned is still in a pretty safe position, right? He has Robert's backing. That's all he needs, right? And so we have this maneuver where we see it's a Cersei and Ned face-off, where Ned puts everything on the ground. He puts it all on the table that he knows, and he's going to tell Robert she needs to back down. But she doesn't. I love the maneuvering between the two as we get the iconic line, when you play the Game of Thrones, you either win or you die. One of my favorite lines. It's why it plays on pretty much every video, and you guys apparently still have not gotten tired of it because I still get comments about my intro. I love that moment. It's a big point for me. It's a little bit of bias because it is so iconic to my channel personally. So I love it. I love everything with Cersei and Ned as Cersei tries to maybe seduce Ned, but Ned doesn't fall for it, and Ned kind of throwing it back in her face, and Cersei trying to get a rise out of Ned. Literally physically, with seducing him, and also mentally trying to get him upset about, who Jon's mother was, even mentioning Ashara. It's a big moment that people kind of speculate on Jon's parents. Even some foreshadowing into, who Jon's real parents are as, he gets upset about, thinking about Lyanna during this face-off as well. I think it's a great chapter. It's the culmination of everything that's been going on with the Lannister reveal. Number 4, I have Catelyn 11, the finale for Catelyn and Robb's story for book 1. It's the King of the North chapter. I don't know what else needs to be said. There's some other good stuff that happens in here, right? The Battle of the Camps, the payoff to that, Catelyn with her father, Hoster, who is, he's just dying. He's losing a mental step, and also physically, he's basically just lying in bed all the time now. It's heartbreaking, right? It's all the seeds being planted for Catelyn because she is someone struggling with the loss of Ned, the losing her father soon, her children are trapped at King's Landing. It's kind of planting that seed that's going to blossom in Clash of Kings. And so it does a great job of setting up the next book, but also concluding her arc really well, right? Because then you also have, everybody debating about what should the North do? What should they do, right? What should Robb do? Should they, sue for peace with the Lannisters, try to trade Jaime for the girls? Should they go behind Stannis and Renly? And you just have that iconic moment of Robb then being named king and really abandoning any chance of peace. And so I love the ending for Catelyn. It's definitely a top 5 chapter for me of this book. Iconic moment, and will always be my favorite moment of the actual show. The show, the King of the North section, is actually my favorite part of the entire show. It's my favorite scene. Outside of the Red Wedding, of course, but it's one of my favorite scenes. So, yeah, that gets us into number 3. Number 3 is going to be Arya 5. I really struggled to place this chapter to me because in a lot of ways it has the biggest moment, I guess, of the entire story. Because it is Arya who is trying to survive in King's Landing using all these survival skills, right? It's even her, similar to Ned, having their ethics be tested, right? She's stealing. She even thinks about, like, for instance, Ned had always told her never to steal, but she has to. What can she do when she's starving? She's going to die if she doesn't steal. It's interesting because it takes everything that Arya's learned, her street smarts and all these things, and puts it to the test. Right, whether this trap that seems to have northern guards, but Arya realizes those aren't northern guards. She doesn't recognize them at all. She doesn't fall for the trap. And so it's this build-up. You feel this unease as you read Arya 5. And as, we get to the Sept of Baelor, it's not only a conclusion for Arya, and I talked about this with Arya 4. I think Arya 4 is really the true conclusion of Arya's kind of arc in this book, but Arya 5 is kind of like a continuation. It almost feels like the beginning of her next arc. And so, watching, as we're helpless, we're there right there with Arya. We're helpless as Ned, confesses, but is still killed. One of the hardest hitting moments for me, because, I talked about this with the show as well. Ned's death is one of the first times, and I was a very impressionable age when I first, witnessed Ned's death, which was in the show, not in the book. I was still, a teenager. I was starting, around getting into like high school. This is one of those first moments where I saw the hero lose, right? And it felt earned. It felt, heartbreaking. And the way it all goes down, it's just, I don't know how you don't put this chapter in your top 5 for this book. It just has to be in there. Because it's the conclusion of Ned, the main character of book 1. Book 1 is the story of Ned. A hard way for him to go out, but for me, I think it lands at number 3. Number 2, my favorite chapter of Ned's arc, I guess of the story of Ned in the book, is Ned 13. Again, this is the setup for the Ned's Coups chapter, but a lot of things happen in this chapter that are really impactful. Let's list them off. Robert's death. Ned, once again, kind of bending his ethics as he kind of, doesn't go word for word what Robert wanted. He says to his next legitimate heir on the will, not Joffrey. He can't bring himself to tell Robert about his children and all these things while he's alive. How is Ned going to handle the succession crisis, right? He turns down Renly from taking, the kids at night and to take power in the middle of the night. His ethics won't allow him to do that, but they're willing to allow him to get Littlefinger to hire the Gold Cloaks. It's everything that's great about it because it sets everything in place and in stage for the next chapter. It's interesting because you see all these different things. How far is Ned willing to go, right? He's not willing to do what Littlefinger suggests. Let Joffrey stay in power, but you are the true power, right? Becoming the Hand of the King, but also the regent named by Robert. He's not willing to do those things. And so it's so much interesting stuff going on because this is the last moment that Ned truly has control of what he could do, right? In this chapter, he could leave, he could run away, which is what he should do. He could do Renly's scheme, Littlefinger's scheme, all these things he could do. This is where he makes the bed that he's going to have to lay in for Ned 14 and 15. I love this chapter. The setup chapter to me is better than the payoff, which is a weird thing to think about. But I like this setup. I love everything that Ned has put through in Ned 13. It feels, very earned for me. And so that places at number 2. Number 1, I really wonder what you guys are gonna think about where I've placed Daenerys in this list, because I think Daenerys is a fantastic POV. I've made that known. I think her last chapter, Daenerys 10, is my favorite and best chapter of the book. It's the perfect conclusion for Daenerys, where she starts out as this shy girl who's being abused, to by the end of it, she is the last dragon, right? She is, this person who brings back dragons into the world, something, nobody's been able to do for hundreds of years. And so you get to this moment with Daenerys where, George plays on the idea, is Daenerys going mad, right? She's doing actions that come off to everybody else as insane. Walking into this funeral pyre, this almost seems suicidal, but Daenerys is steadfast, confident in herself. And that reveal, when she comes out of it and she has the dragons, it completely changes the story, right? It completely shifts everything, right? And so I think it's the perfect ending. I think it's the perfect ending to not only Game of Thrones, but it's also, I think, the perfect ending for Daenerys, who slowly, over the course of the reread, became not the best POV of the book, because I still think it's Ned, but I think my favorite to actually cover of the series that I did. And so this was a long video. This was at least probably 2 hours, 2.5 hours. And I hope you guys all enjoyed it. This is really the last time I'm actually talking about a Game of Thrones in depthly. As I already kind of did the stream where I talked about my actual full thoughts about the book. This is my last real, piece of content that I'm recording. And I wanted to say thank you for everybody that if you got to the end of this video or you watched my reread, I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope, better things are to come with The Clash of Kings, my favorite book. And yeah, I'll see you guys all in the next one. And bye, guys.